Hey guys, tonight we step into a place that smells of pipe smoke, ink, and the faint perfume of mystery. It's foggy outside. London fog. The kind that softens the edges of the street lamps and turns footsteps into whispers. You can almost feel the chill creeping under your collar, the faint rattle of a carriage wheel over cobblestone. This is Baker Street, sometime in the late 19th century, when horses still outnumbered motor cars and a good overcoat was the difference between respectability and pneumonia. You're about to meet a man whose mind could cut through that fog like a blade. A violin-playing, cocaine-taking, logic-obsessed enigma named Sherlock Holmes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere cozy tonight, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive on Baker Street, the air cold enough that each breath leaves a little ghost behind you. Number 221B looks ordinary from the outside. Brick facade, clean windows, the kind of place you'd pass without a second glance. But when you climb those narrow stairs, you step into another world entirely. Inside, chaos reigns. But it's a specific kind of chaos, the kind that feels strangely alive. Papers are scattered across tables, the faint smell of chemicals and gunpowder lingers, and somewhere a kettle whistles weakly on a stove that's seen better days. On the mantelpiece sits a skull with a candle stub melted into it. You blink, uncertain whether it's a decoration or an experiment. And then you hear it. The sound of a violin, playing not a tune but a thought. The notes rise and fall like questions that haven't yet found their answers. Sherlock Holmes sits in the window's light, tall and lean, his face both gaunt and intense, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. He's smoking a pipe and staring at a hat, a plain bowler on the table before him, as though it holds the key to the universe. "You see, Watson," he says, because of course Dr. Watson is here too, notebook in hand, half exasperated and half in awe. "This hat tells us everything about its owner. Married certainly, though not happily. His fortune declined, but his habits of cleanliness remain. Note the wear on the left brim. He's recently taken to carrying it under his arm, perhaps in nervousness. And look here, the dust along the back edge. It tells us he keeps it on a high shelf, too high for a short man. Curious, isn't it? You stand there, transfixed, because Holmes is talking about a hat as if it's a living witness to its owner's soul. Dr. Watson, our loyal narrator and the bridge between genius and normalcy, just sighs and mutters, "Holmes, really?" But you can tell he's impressed too. That's the first thing you learn about this world. Nothing escapes Holmes's attention, not the smallest stain or faintest scent. He doesn't just see, he observes. Outside, London moves like a living creature. Cabs rattle, fog clings to lampposts, and headlines scream about crimes that seem impossible to solve. But here in this room, time slows. Holmes picks up a newspaper and flips it open. "Murder in Brixton," he murmurs, eyes scanning. A German word scrawled in blood on the wall, Rache, revenge. Watson blinks. "How could you possibly know that already?" Holmes smiles faintly, because it's obvious. It's his first great case, a study in scarlet. But we'll get there soon. For now, just imagine what it must have been like to live in this city at the height of the Victorian age. The year is around 1881. Queen Victoria still reigns, the empire stretches across the globe, and London is a paradox, a city of great invention and great misery. Electric lights are only just arriving. Most homes still rely on gas lamps and coal fires. Horses leave trails of steam in the chill dawn air, and the Thames smells faintly of industry and regret. And in the middle of it all, One detective and one doctor begin a partnership that will outlive them both. When you first meet Holmes, he's unlike anyone you've ever known. He knows chemistry, anatomy, botany, law, handwriting, perfume, cigar ash, and the tracks of every kind of carriage wheel in London. Yet he can't tell you whether the earth revolves around the sun or vice versa, because, as he once says, it makes no difference to my work. Watson, recently returned from Afghanistan with a wounded shoulder and a restless soul, finds himself sharing lodgings with this impossible man purely by chance. The rent is reasonable, and Watson figures he can tolerate the eccentricities. He has no idea he's about to witness history being made. There's a certain warmth between them from the start. A tension, too, the kind that balances admiration and frustration. Watson represents the ordinary person, the reader, you. He's the voice that translates Holmes's lightning-fast thoughts into something human. And perhaps that's why their friendship endures. Because beneath all the logic, Holmes needs someone who believes in him. Not as an experiment, but as a man. It's strange to think that this world was invented not by a detective, but by a doctor. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who first introduced Holmes in 1887. Doyle was a physician before he was a writer. He built Holmes out of memory and admiration for one of his professors at medical school, Dr. Joseph Bell, a man whose powers of observation were legendary. Bell could diagnose a patient before they spoke a word, simply by studying the mud on their boots or the calluses on their hands. Doyle took that idea and asked, what if someone applied such precision not to medicine, but to crime? Thus Holmes was born. But the funny thing is, Doyle didn't think his detective was that special. In letters, he called Holmes a somewhat mechanical creation. He preferred his historical novels, which almost no one remembers now. And yet, readers couldn't get enough of the detective and his doctor companion. Londoners lined up at bookshops for new stories. Holmes became so real that people wrote letters to 221B Baker Street asking him for help with their own mysteries. That's your quirky detail for the night. There was even a clerk employed for years just to answer those letters. Imagine that. Replying to people who believed a fictional man could solve their very real troubles. Back inside the room, Holmes has lit a cigarette and begun pacing. He does this often, moving, thinking, muttering fragments of clues. Sometimes he'll collapse onto the couch for hours, lost in thought or experimentation. At other times, he's a whirlwind of energy, dashing out the door with his coat flying behind him, Watson scrambling to keep up. Where are we going, Holmes? To the scene of the crime, of course. But you haven't even finished your tea. Then it shall wait until the case is solved. And so begins the rhythm of their lives. Long nights, endless tea, ink-stained notebooks, and the occasional bullet hole in the wall. Holmes enjoys practicing with his revolver indoors, much to Mrs. Hudson's horror. He's not easy to live with. He keeps tobacco in the toe of a Persian slipper. He plays the violin at 2 a.m. when he's bored. And sometimes, when his mind starves for mystery, he reaches for the 7% solution of cocaine. Watson worries, of course. But Holmes shrugs it off. I cannot rest when the world is dull, he says. My mind rebels at stagnation. It's an odd truth. Brilliance and loneliness often travel together. One evening, as the rain drums against the window, Holmes looks up from his violin and says softly, Do you know what I love most about London, Watson? The museums, the cases, the curry houses? No. Holmes smiles faintly. The fog. It hides everything, yet in hiding, it reveals. That's the heart of his method. He doesn't see the world as you or I do. Where others see chaos, he sees threads waiting to be untangled. His mantra is simple. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains? however improbable, must be the truth. He lives by it. You will too before the night is over. There's a scholarly uncertainty that lingers even now. Who is Sherlock Holmes, truly? Some biographers argue he's a composite of multiple real detectives. Others insist he's partly autobiographical, Doyle's alter ego. Some even claim Holmes represents the spirit of science itself. Victorian rationality battling superstition in an age still haunted by ghosts. Perhaps that's why his world endures. It isn't just about solving crimes. It's about searching for order in the endless fog of human nature. The clock on the mantel strikes 10. The violin rests silent now. Outside, the gaslights flicker in the damp night. Holmes sits by the fire, eyes half closed, smoke curling around him like thought made visible. Watson writes quietly at his desk, describing the case of the mysterious hat and the forgotten owner. And you, sitting there between them, can feel something taking shape. A partnership, a mythology, a dance between logic and wonder that will outlast its creator. Before long, they'll be drawn into a murder that will make Holmes famous. One that begins with a corpse in an abandoned house and ends with the word revenge written in blood. But for now, in this peaceful pause before chaos, you can just listen to the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. The detective hasn't yet met his greatest cases, his greatest enemies, or his greatest heartbreaks. But you're here at the beginning, in a small London flat, with two men and a mystery waiting on the doorstep. And all of it begins with a single line in Watson's notebook. It is with some reluctance that I take up my pen to set down the facts of one of the most singular cases of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fog thickens outside. The game is about to begin. The fog over Baker Street never really lifts. It just changes color with the hour. In the morning, it's gray. In the afternoon, it's the color of weak tea. And by evening, it deepens into something almost theatrical, swirling under the street lamps like the curtain before a play. Inside 221B, that fog filters through the cracked windows and turns the lamplight golden. A soft haze that smells faintly of coal and rain. You sit by the fire again tonight, the coals pulsing like sleepy embers. Dr. Watson is polishing his boots. Holmes stands at the mantel, lost in the kind of silence that feels alive. You've seen it before. The silence that means his mind is sprinting while the rest of him stands still. His eyes flick between the violin, the test tubes on the table, the newspaper folded on the chair. You can almost hear the gears turning. When he finally speaks, his voice cuts through the quiet. "Watson," he says, "the most tragic thing about most crimes is that they are not mysterious at all." Watson glances up, bemused. "You mean to say there's nothing romantic about them?" "Precisely," Holmes replies. "Human motive is tediously predictable. Love, money, revenge, sometimes all three. But the manner of concealment, that, my dear fellow, is where art begins." You can't help but smile. Only Holmes could call murder art. If there's one thing you learn living alongside Sherlock Holmes, it's that boredom is more dangerous to him than any criminal. He can go days without sleep when on a case. Yet one quiet afternoon can drive him to pacing, violin improvisations, or even chemical experiments that end with Mrs. Hudson hammering on the door, shouting about the smell. Tonight, though, he's calm, focused. There's a letter open on the table, crisp, expensive stationery, written in a firm hand. A client, of course. There's always a client. Watson picks it up, squints, and reads aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I require your immediate assistance in a matter of the utmost delicacy. My husband has taken to vanishing at odd hours, leaving traces of some dark enterprise behind. I dare not approach the police. Meet me tomorrow morning at 10. Yours sincerely, Lady Brackenstall." Holmes smiles slightly, folding his hands together, An adulterous husband? Or an innocent man with a secret hobby? Watson raises an eyebrow. Perhaps he simply likes walking at night. No one simply walks at night in this city, Holmes replies. Not unless they're chasing something or being chased. You find yourself walking with them the next morning through the half-awake streets of London. Carriages rattle past, milkmen whistle, and somewhere a church bell tolls. Holmes moves quickly, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow that can't keep up. When you reach the house in question, a fine residence near Hyde Park, Lady Brackenstall receives you in a sitting room full of flowers and unease. She's young, beautiful, but her eyes flick nervously toward the door. She insists her husband has grown secretive, possibly dangerous. There are whispers of another woman, perhaps of debt, perhaps of violence. Watson, ever the gentleman, tries to reassure her. Holmes, meanwhile, studies everything but her words. His gaze moves across the room, the faint scratch on the mantel, the misplaced ashtray, the empty space where a portrait once hung. When Lady Brackenstall finishes her story, he simply says, "I'll need to see the bedroom. You follow them upstairs." Holmes moves like a bloodhound, silent but certain. He kneels beside the bed, examines the carpet, the curtains, even the pattern of dust on the window latch. "Watson," he says softly, "observe this. Mud on the sill, but none on the floor. Someone climbed out, not in." Watson frowns. Then the husband's story must be false, or perfectly true, Holmes replies, depending on who wrote it. That's the maddening beauty of him. Where others see contradiction, he sees possibility. You can feel the air itself growing sharper around him, as if London holds its breath whenever he begins to think. Later that afternoon, back at Baker Street, Holmes sprawls across the couch with his hands steepled beneath his chin. Watson sits opposite, notebook open, waiting. Holmes begins. "The human brain, Watson, is like an attic. It can only hold so much. The trick is to store only what is useful." Watson chuckles. "And what of poetry or art?" "Decorative clutter," Holmes says, eyes half closed. "Delightful, but inefficient." You can't tell whether he's serious or teasing. Maybe both. That philosophy is part of what makes Holmes unique. In an age when spiritualism and seances are fashionable, he believes in nothing but evidence. While others chase ghosts, he chases footprints. When others pray, he calculates. And yet, for all his logic, there's something strangely poetic about him. The way he speaks, the way he plays the violin in the dark, the way he notices beauty in the pattern of cigarette ash or the swirl of fog in a street lamp beam. He's science wrapped in art. The fire crackles. The rain begins again. And Holmes is at it once more, experimenting. On the table, test tubes bubble with mysterious colors. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," Watson says, "what is that smell? Benzene? Sodium carbonate? Perhaps a trace of rosin?" Holmes murmurs. "I'm recreating the chemical signature of blood when mixed with writing ink. It may be useful for forgery cases." Watson groans. "You'll destroy the curtains. Then I shall deduce their replacement value." Holmes replies dryly. You can't help but laugh quietly. The two men bicker like brothers. Watson brings stability, food, and warmth. Holmes brings chaos, brilliance, and occasional danger. Together, they balance each other out like the scales of justice. Outside, London's underworld is thriving. The city has its share of murderers, smugglers, jewel thieves, and con men. The newspapers call them fiends, but Holmes never uses that word. To him, a criminal is not evil so much as interesting. Each mind, whether noble or corrupt, is a puzzle waiting to be solved. He once told Watson, "There is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact," and you begin to see what he means. Every great mind needs an audience. And for Holmes, that audience is you. And Watson, of course. When Watson writes the stories, he adds warmth to Holmes's cold precision. In those pages, London breathes. Hansom cabs rattling through drizzle, street vendors shouting, gaslight glinting on puddles. Holmes himself becomes less of a man and more of a myth. Aloof, untouchable, extraordinary. But here, in the quiet between cases, you see the other side of him. The sleeplessness, the melancholy, the violin melodies that wander into minor keys. There's an old rumor, never confirmed, that Holmes was based not only on Dr. Joseph Bell, but also on the darker half of Doyle himself. The author's fascination with reason, his frustration with superstition, his desire to control a chaotic world. Some scholars argue that Holmes is Doyle's wishful self, while Watson represents his reality. Grounded, emotional, limited, we'll never know for sure. Historians still argue about it, but perhaps that's fitting. After all, mystery is Holmes's native language. A knock on the door interrupts the quiet. Mrs. Hudson calls up the stairs. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes takes it, reads it, and immediately stands. "Watson, bring your coat. Scotland Yard requires our presence." And just like that, the stillness dissolves. The detective is alive again. His eyes gleam, his voice sharpens. They've found another body. The word Rach written beside it. Again, Watson stares. "Another?" "Yes," Holmes replies, already halfway down the stairs. "The murderer wishes to be theatrical. Let us indulge him." You hurry after them, your breath clouding in the cold air. The streets are slick with rain, the lamps glowing like ghostly sentinels. Somewhere in the darkness, a constable's whistle shrills. Holmes moves swiftly, cloak flaring behind him, every stride purposeful. You realize he's not guessing, he's anticipating. When you reach the crime scene, a small house in Brixton, the yard is crawling with policemen. Inspector Lestrade greets them, looking both relieved and defensive. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, we've got the scene as best we can." Quite the puzzle, this one. Holmes doesn't answer. He's already inside, scanning every inch of the room. You watch him crouch beside the body, touch the wall, smell the air. He notices things no one else does. The faint scuff on the floor, the peculiar tilt of a candle holder, the absence of footprints where there should be many. After a few minutes, he stands. "Gentlemen," he says, "our killer was left-handed, taller than average, recently in America, and traveling under a false name. He used poison, not violence, and he made a single, fatal mistake." Lestrade gapes. How could you possibly know all that? Holmes smiles thinly, because it's obvious. You can't help it. You shiver. Back at Baker Street hours later, Holmes explains it all as though it were simple arithmetic. The cigar ash unique to a certain brand, the layout of the room suggesting deceit, the German word Rach, revenge, meant not as message, but as misdirection. The killer wanted the police to chase the wrong story, and chase it they did, until Holmes caught the truth, as always, hiding in plain sight. When it's over, he pours himself a cup of cold tea, as though nothing remarkable has occurred. Watson scribbles furiously, trying to capture every detail before it fades. "Do you never tire of it, Holmes?" he asks. "Of the chase, the puzzle, the danger?" Holmes gazes at the fire. "On the contrary, Watson. The world is full of noise, but a mystery, a true mystery, is the only thing that makes it quiet." You sit there for a while, letting that line settle. Outside, the fog thickens again. The lamplight flickers. Somewhere in London, another secret waits to be found. And in the soft, steady rhythm of the city, you realize that for Holmes, there will always be another case, another shadow, another impossible puzzle to bring into the light. The morning that begins. A study in scarlet feels heavy with rain and coal smoke. It's one of those London mornings where even the birds sound tired. You wake to the clatter of china, the rustle of newspapers, and the steady rhythm of Holmes's violin. The notes are soft, deliberate, like footsteps creeping through fog. Watson sits at his desk, writing in that compact, precise hand of his. He's been documenting their latest case, though you can tell he's struggling to find the right tone. After all, how do you describe a man like Sherlock Holmes without sounding like you've made him up? Holmes, he says, looking up, do you ever worry people won't believe these stories? Holmes doesn't pause his playing. If they don't believe them, Watson, it's because you've told them well. Fiction always sounds more convincing than truth. He stops, sets the violin aside, and turns to the newspaper. And speaking of truth, it appears we have another opportunity to chase it. You glance at the headline. Mysterious Death in Brixton Road. A word scrawled in blood. The police baffled. The victim, an American. No sign of robbery. No wound to explain the death. Holmes's eyes light up. The game, Watson, is afoot. By the time you reach Brixton, the air is thick and sour. The fog presses close like a damp blanket. Holmes strides ahead, his long coat sweeping the ground, while Watson hurries beside him, his breath misting in the cold. At the scene, Inspector Lestrade stands with his arms crossed, looking both competent and completely out of his depth. Morning, Mr. Holmes. A curious one, this. Fellow's dead as stone, no mark on him. Word Reich written on the wall in blood. German for revenge, I'm told. Holmes doesn't reply. He's already walking slow circles around the room, head tilted like a hawk's. You watch him kneel, touch the floor, sniff the air. No smell of gas, no traces of cordite. The blood isn't the victim's. Too dark, too thin. Lestrade frowns. Not his, but there's no other man here. There was, Holmes says quietly. And he left by the window. He points to a faint footprint, half a shoe print really, pressed into the thin layer of grime on the sill. A cabman's heel, iron-edged. He brought the victim here alive. They argued. The victim drank something, poison perhaps. The murderer tried to stage the scene, but his hand shook when he wrote Reich. Watson stares. You can tell all that from a footprint? Holmes glances up, faintly amused. From the footprint and from the ash in the corner. That's Trichinopoly cigar ash. Distinctive. Few smoke it outside of America. He straightens, brushing off his knees. Our killer is American, recently arrived, tall, left-handed, and, if I'm not mistaken, missing a wedding ring. Lestrade blinks. You've seen him? No, Holmes says. I've seen enough. It's easy to forget that Holmes wasn't born a legend. In these early cases, he's still proving himself to the world, and in a way, to Watson. Scotland Yard tolerates him, half admiring, half irritated. They think he's a showman, a magician of deduction. But Holmes doesn't crave fame. He craves clarity. When you return to Baker Street that evening, he's already at work again. On the table lie chemical flasks, a violin bow, and a battered notebook filled with lists of crimes, poisons, and handwriting samples. He paces as he speaks, his thoughts leaping faster than Watson's pen can follow. Revenge, Watson, is rarely so literal. The word Reich was meant to mislead. Our murderer is no foreign revolutionary. He's a man of passion, but not of intellect. A coachman, perhaps. A common man driven by uncommon grief. Watson frowns. You make it sound almost sympathetic. Holmes stops pacing. A murderer may be a monster, but every monster begins as a man. It's one of those rare moments when Holmes seems almost human, touched for an instant by the weight of what he sees every day. Then he shakes it off, lights his pipe, and disappears into smoke and silence. Later that night, you find him staring out the window at the street below. "Tell me, Watson," he says softly, "why do you think people commit murder?" Watson considers. "Jealousy, desperation, rage, madness." Holmes murmurs. "And sometimes, because they can't think of anything else to do." It's an unsettling thought. But that's how Holmes's mind works. Where others seek moral lessons, he sees patterns. To him, crime is not chaos, it's mathematics. Every passion leaves a formula. Every lie has a fingerprint. And that's the secret to his method. He doesn't solve crimes. He translates them. The next morning, a telegram arrives. Lestrade again. Another body. This one found in an abandoned house near the Thames. Same signs. No wound, no struggle. The word Rach written once more. Holmes's eyes gleam. "Excellent," he says. "At last, a proper series." Watson sighs. "Only you would call murder a series." Within the hour, you're on the move again. Cabs, fog, the scent of the river. The house is small, the air stale with damp. Holmes kneels beside the corpse. This time, he smiles faintly. Poison, yes. But notice the dust on his boots. Fresh, clay-heavy. And the key in his pocket? It's for a hotel in Euston, the same district where our first victim lodged. Lestrade looks lost. "You're saying they knew each other?" "Precisely. Two Americans. Partners in something unsavory. And now one's dead, the other soon will be." Holmes straightens. "We must go, Watson, quickly." "To where?" "To find the cabman who has been conveniently waiting for us at every turn." You follow them into the street, your heart quickening as Holmes hails a passing cab. The driver tips his hat politely. "Evening, gentlemen. Where to?" Holmes smiles. "Oh, we'll discuss that inside." Watson looks puzzled but climbs in. The moment the door shuts, Holmes locks it from the inside. "Jefferson Hope," he says softly. "That's your name, isn't it?" The cabman stiffens, eyes narrowing. Holmes continues, voice calm but deadly certain. "You were in love once, with Lucy Ferrier. Your rival forced her to marry another. When she died, you swore vengeance. You followed her tormentors to London and killed them, one by one, using poison so they might die as she did. Slowly, unseen, you left Rach as a message, but not for us, for her." The cab jerks to a stop. For a moment, the only sound is the rain on the roof. Then the cabman sighs. "You're right, of course. It's over just like that." The confession comes quietly, without struggle. The man's story, when told, is tragic rather than cruel. A love turned to ash, an obsession carried across oceans. When it's done, Watson writes it all down, his pen scratching softly into the night. Back at Baker Street, the fire burns low. Holmes lounges in his chair, reading an anatomy textbook upside down. Watson closes his notebook. "Do you ever pity them, Holmes? The murderers, I mean." Holmes's eyes flick up, sharp as ever. "Pity, yes, but never sympathy. A doctor may pity disease, Watson, but he does not embrace it." He stretches, yawns, and smiles faintly. "Besides, the cure is always the same. Truth. You can almost feel the warmth of the fire against your skin, the distant hum of carriages outside. For now, the world is quiet again. But you know it won't stay that way. Holmes thrives on the impossible, and London has plenty more impossibilities to offer. Somewhere out there, beneath the gaslight and the fog, another story is already beginning. A story of greed, of love, of a locked chest and a one-legged man, of a treasure buried beneath the Thames. Holmes closes his eyes, murmuring, "The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes." Watson smiles. "Then I suppose we'll just have to keep observing." And in that dim little room above Baker Street, the partnership is sealed. The detective, the doctor, and you, the silent witness to it all. The city exhales a long, smoky breath. The fog thickens once more. The next adventure is waiting. London never truly sleeps. It only shifts from one kind of waking to another. By day it hums, a living clockwork of carriages, clerks, and chatter. By night it murmurs, a softer, stranger heartbeat full of secrets. You walk beside Holmes through this nocturnal version of the city, past taverns closing their shutters, past policemen tapping their truncheons in rhythm on wet cobblestones. Every shadow here feels like a clue waiting to be noticed. Every echo sounds like an unfinished thought. Holmes doesn't seem to hear the city the way you do. He dissects it. His eyes flick between details, memorizing the worn edges of doorsteps, the pattern of soot on window panes, the tracks left by wheels too narrow for ordinary cabs. "Watson," he says suddenly, "if you wish to know what's happening in London at any given moment, look at its boots. The truth is written in mud." Watson laughs softly, breath fogging in the cold. "And here I thought you preferred books." Holmes gives a half smile. "Books tell you what men thought. Boots tell you what they did. You're beginning to understand him better now." His world runs on inference. Tiny observations stacked so high they become revelation. It's beautiful, if a little exhausting. The case tonight is smaller, less dramatic than murder. It's theft, or rather, a string of them. A set of forged government documents has vanished from a clerk's office in Westminster, and Scotland Yard, predictably, has no idea where to begin. Holmes was called in that morning. He accepted instantly, not for the reward, but for the puzzle. You walk with him and Watson toward the narrow side street where the theft took place. The lamps burn low, throwing orange pools of light onto the wet stone. Inside the clerk's office, the air smells of paper and ink. Desks stand neatly in rows, all except one that's been rifled through. The senior clerk, pale and anxious, explains that nothing but a few sealed envelopes was taken, documents concerning foreign correspondence, though he won't say which countries. Holmes listens with polite disinterest, his attention elsewhere. He kneels beside a half-open window, examining a faint smear on the frame. "Candle wax," he murmurs. "But not from a candle. It's sealing wax. And there's grit mixed with it. Sand, perhaps, from a messenger's pouch." Watson leans over his shoulder. "So the thief was a messenger." Holmes shakes his head. "Too simple. The wax came from the bottom of the window latch, meaning the thief was left-handed and careless. Observe also the ink stain on the floor, shaped like a thumbprint, his pen hand." He rises, brushing dust from his knees. "We're not hunting a stranger, gentlemen. We're hunting an employee." The clerk gasps. "Impossible." "On the contrary," Holmes says, "the impossible merely requires better lighting." Back on Baker Street, the fire crackles and rain taps against the windows. Watson sits cross-legged in his chair, trying to piece together Holmes's chain of logic. "You always make it sound so easy," he says. "As if the truth were a coin dropped in plain sight." Holmes chuckles. "The truth is in plain sight, my dear Watson. It's the eyes that are closed." He retrieves a violin from its case, plucks a few experimental notes, then begins to play. A low, melancholy tune that somehow carries the rhythm of London itself. You can feel the sound vibrate through the room. It's not performance. It's thinking. When he finally sets the violin down, he speaks softly. "Do you know, Watson, that the average man sees but does not observe? He glances at a wall and then forgets the cracks, at a face and forgets the eyes. He lives surrounded by evidence and dies blind to it." Watson smiles. "And you don't?" Holmes stares into the fire. "I can't afford to. You sense that beneath the intellect there's a loneliness there. An understanding that being able to see everything often means you can't belong anywhere. The next day brings another letter, this time from a jeweler in Cheapside whose shop has been robbed under impossible circumstances. The locks were untouched, the windows unbroken, yet £10,000 in diamonds are gone. Holmes raises an eyebrow. At last, something interesting. By afternoon, you're all standing in a cramped little shop filled with glittering glass cases. The jeweler wrings his hands nervously, explaining how he closed at 7 the night before and returned this morning to find the diamonds gone. Nothing else was taken, not even the cheaper pieces left on display. Holmes doesn't answer right away. He walks the perimeter, glancing at the ceiling, the corners, the hinges. Then he crouches by one of the display cases. "Watson, hand me your cane." Watson passes it over. Holmes slides the cane into the tiny gap between the case and the floor, then tilts his head. "Hollow," he murmurs. There's a compartment beneath the display. He taps the floor twice. The boards shift slightly, revealing a narrow space stuffed with sawdust and thread. He pulls out a small brass contraption, something between a clockwork and a trapdoor latch. "Ah," he says. "Ingenious. The thief worked underneath the floorboards. He must have accessed them through the coal chute." The jeweler gasps. "But that chute's sealed off." "Was sealed," Holmes corrects. "Last night it wasn't. The dust on the hinges is fresh." Lestrade, who's arrived late and flustered, mutters, "You make it sound like you were here." Holmes gives a faint smile. "In a sense I was." Within hours, the thief, a former apprentice with debts and an inventive streak, is caught. The jewels are recovered from a chimney flue. Holmes returns home quietly triumphant. Watson pours 2 glasses of brandy. "To the art of deduction," he says. Holmes raises his glass. "To the art of observation," he corrects. By now, word of the detective on Baker Street has spread through London like fire through fog. His name appears in gossip columns, whispered at dinner parties. Some say he's a fraud, others that he's half machine. There's even a rumor that he's secretly employed by the Queen herself. Watson finds the whole thing amusing. Holmes finds it irritating. "Public attention," he says, "is the natural enemy of concentration. But fame has its uses. Clients come from all ranks, lords and shopkeepers, actresses and widows, bankers and thieves. Holmes never discriminates. To him, a mystery is a mystery, whether it comes from a palace or a pawn shop. You begin to notice a pattern in how he works. Every case starts with listening. Holmes lets people talk, lets them trip over their own half-truths. Then he asks a question so simple it feels cruel. And in that one question, the whole facade collapses. He listens not just to words, but to pauses, to the heartbeat of fear that hides between syllables. You realize he isn't solving crimes so much as diagnosing humanity. One evening, as the fog thickens again, Watson looks up from his writing. "Holmes," he says quietly, "what would you have been if not a detective?" Holmes doesn't look up from the letter he's reading. "A violinist, perhaps, or a chemist, or nothing at all." Watson smiles. "Surely you'd find something to occupy yourself." "Perhaps," Holmes replies. "But the mind is a delicate instrument, Watson. Without use, it corrodes. You can feel the truth of it in his tone. It's not arrogance, it's survival. Holmes needs puzzles like lungs need air. That's why, even after solving 3 cases in a week, he's restless again by morning. He sits cross-legged on the floor, flipping through old newspapers, searching for patterns no one else would see. Then suddenly he stops, eyes narrowing. "Watson, do you recall our jeweler's thief? It seems his invention has inspired others." Watson peers over his shoulder. "Another robbery?" "Yes," Holmes says. "But this time, not jewels. A map, a military map, taken from the Admiralty office itself. He grins faintly, and there's that familiar spark again, the thrill of a storm approaching. Pack your revolver, Watson. We may be dealing with something larger than theft. You leave Baker Street at dusk, following the pair into the maze of London's government quarter. The cobblestones glisten like oil. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben tolls, deep and steady as fate. By midnight, the case will lead you through underground tunnels, into secret rooms, and toward a man whose genius rivals Holmes's own, but with motives far darker. For now, though, as the detective lights his pipe and the rain begins again, you can feel the pulse of the city quicken around you. The fog rolls in. The lamps flicker. Holmes smiles without looking back. "Come along," he says. "The night is full of evidence." The rain over the Thames has a metallic taste tonight, like iron and ink. The kind of rain that smears the gaslight and turns the city's reflections into ghostly doubles. You trail Holmes and Watson through the narrow arteries of London, boots splashing through puddles that mirror the lamps above. Holmes's long coat flares behind him, its hem soaked and glistening, but he doesn't seem to notice. When the world blurs, his mind sharpens. "Watson," he says suddenly, as you duck under a dripping archway, "you'll want your pistol loaded for this one. The thief we pursue tonight does not merely steal, he collects." "Collects what exactly?" Watson asks. "Secrets," Holmes replies. "And secrets, my dear doctor, are worth more than gold." The wind off the river smells of coal and salt. Somewhere, a ship's horn moans through the fog. You follow the pair into a quiet street lined with warehouses. Holmes stops in front of one, its shutters closed, its windows dark. A sign reads, "Sholto and Sons Shipping." "Now this," Holmes murmurs, "is where it begins." Inside, the air is thick with dust and the faint perfume of teak wood. Crates are stacked like tombs. In one corner, the faintest trace of candlelight flickers through the slats of a closed door. Holmes signals for silence. You hear faint voices within, two men arguing in whispers. "You were to meet the Agra boat at dawn," one hisses. "If the police find out—" The other voice interrupts, trembling. "I told you, I've hidden the map. The treasure's safe." Watson's eyes widen, but Holmes only smiles. That slight, dangerous smile that means he's already 10 steps ahead. He pushes the door open with the tip of his cane. The two men inside, burly, rough, one missing a leg, freeze mid-sentence. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes says. "I'd offer to knock, but you seem busy hiding stolen property." The shorter man lunges, but Holmes sidesteps, effortless. The scuffle lasts mere seconds. Watson grabs the shorter man by the collar while Holmes trips the other neatly with his cane. They fall like dominoes. When it's over, Holmes kneels by a desk littered with papers. He picks up a sheet, the edge still damp with spilled gin, and reads aloud, "The treasure of Agra shall be divided. Sholto, Small, and Morstan, each a fourth share." Holmes sighs. "Ah, so this is what we're dealing with. The sign of 4. You watch him move about the room, piecing together fragments of story like bones from an unburied skeleton. "Years ago," he begins, "during the Indian Mutiny, 4 men found a hoard of jewels. Loot from a murdered prince, perhaps. They swore a pact. Each would guard the secret until they could safely divide it. But greed corrodes even the strongest vows." Watson listens, fascinated. "And these men?" 3 turned traitor. The 4th, Jonathan Small, the one-legged man you see before you, was betrayed and imprisoned. He's come to reclaim what he lost." Small glares from the floor. "You think you know everything, don't you, Mr. Holmes? But you can't guess what it feels like. To rot for decades, while others grow fat on your share." Holmes studies him for a moment. "On the contrary," he says softly, I know exactly what it's like to wait. There's something in his tone that silences even the prisoner. You realize Holmes's empathy isn't absent. It's simply disguised as precision. He doesn't mock pain. He measures it. By dawn, Scotland Yard has the treasure locked away. Small and his accomplice are led off in chains. Holmes and Watson return to Baker Street, both silent, both changed. Watson seems troubled. "You pitied him, didn't you?" he asks once they're home. Holmes shrugs. Pity is an emotion. What I felt was recognition, greed, revenge, obsession. These are the constants of the human equation. I merely solve for X. He leans back in his chair, exhaustion softening his sharp edges. The morning light filters through the blinds, striping his face with gold and shadow. "Still," he adds, "I can't deny it's a rare pleasure to see arithmetic balanced so neatly." Watson laughs quietly. "You're the strangest man alive." "Possibly," Holmes says, "but also the most awake." Later that week, the case becomes the talk of London. The newspapers call it the Agra Affair. They embellish it with romance and danger, painting Holmes as a gallant hero. Watson, who has begun writing his version of events, worries it's too sensational. "You'll hate it," he tells Holmes one evening. "It reads more like a novel than a report." Holmes chuckles. "Then it will sell wonderfully." And indeed, it does. Watson's first published story makes Holmes famous overnight. Strangers begin recognizing him on the street. Baker Street becomes a pilgrimage site for curiosity seekers. Holmes, predictably, loathes every moment of it. "Public fascination," he complains, "is proof of collective boredom." Yet, in quieter moments, you can tell he doesn't mind Watson's fame. He even teases him about it. "You've turned me into a myth," he says one night, smiling faintly. "One day, someone will believe I never existed." Watson looks up from his notebook. "You make that sound like a challenge." Holmes just laughs and returns to his violin. The following months blur into a procession of cases, each stranger than the last. A missing racehorse found miles away without its groom. A dying message scrawled in chalk inside a locked room. A royal scandal hushed before it could topple a throne. Each time, the pattern repeats. Holmes sees what others overlook, and Watson records it for the world to marvel at. But there's one evening, deep in the winter of 1889, that stays with you. The three of you sit by the fire, Holmes, Watson, and you, listening to the muffled bells of St. Marylebone. Snow drifts outside the window, soft as ash. Holmes holds a letter in his hand, reading it over for the third time. "It's from a lady," he murmurs, "a most unusual one." Watson raises an eyebrow. "You sound almost nervous." "Not nervous," Holmes corrects. Intrigued, he folds the letter carefully. Her name is Irene Adler. The case begins the next morning with a carriage, a scandal, and a photograph. You'll remember every detail. The way Holmes adjusts his collar before leaving, the rare note of hesitation in his voice, the slight smile Watson tries and fails to hide. Irene Adler, it turns out, possesses something that could ruin a European monarch. A compromising photograph from her past affair with the King of Bohemia. The king, desperate to retrieve it before his upcoming marriage, hires Holmes in secret. "She is beautiful, no doubt," the king says pompously, pacing Baker Street. "But she is an adventuress, a schemer, a woman of the stage. You will, of course, have no trouble outwitting her." Holmes says nothing. He only smiles and lights a cigarette. "We shall see." You find yourself shadowing them through London's more elegant streets. Opera houses, carriages gleaming like beetles, gentlemen bowing to ladies in winter cloaks. Holmes, in disguise as a shabby groom, looks utterly out of place among the silk and perfume. He watches Irene's house from across the street, noting every visitor, every routine. "She's careful," he murmurs. "Too careful." Then, one afternoon, His opportunity arrives. A staged fight, a feigned injury, a quick rescue at her doorstep. She brings him inside, kind, unsuspecting. Watson, following his instructions, tosses a smoke rocket through the window moments later. The chaos that follows is pure theater. Irene rushes to retrieve the hidden photograph, exactly as Holmes predicted, revealing its location. When the smoke clears, she has no idea she's been tricked. Holmes leaves, triumphant, smiling under his disguise. "The game is over," he says. "Tomorrow the king shall have his treasure." But he is wrong. That night, when they return to claim the photograph, Irene Adler is gone. Fled the country, leaving behind only a letter addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It reads, "You did not deceive me long, sir. When a woman loves, she sees more clearly than a man who reasons. I thank you for teaching me that. I keep the photograph for protection, not revenge. Rest assured, it will trouble no one. Farewell." Holmes reads it twice, then folds it carefully. "She outwitted me," he says, almost in wonder. "The woman." Watson looks stunned. "You're not angry?" "Angry?" Holmes smiles faintly. "No, Watson. Admiration is a more productive emotion." And though he never admits it aloud, you can tell he's changed. Irene Adler remains, in his mind, the single person who truly matched him. Neither enemy nor lover, but something rarer, an equal. Later that evening, long after Watson has gone to bed, you find Holmes by the fire again. He's holding the letter in one hand and his violin in the other. The melody he plays is soft, wistful, unlike anything you've heard from him before. You realize it's not for himself, it's for her. For the memory of a game played perfectly on both sides. He looks up at you as the last note fades. "She'll never know it, of course," he says. But that is as it should be. Outside, the snow begins to fall again. Silent, deliberate, covering London's footprints until all the world looks clean. And for once, Holmes seems content to let it. The days after the Irene Adler affair feel quieter, almost too quiet. The fog outside hangs heavier over Baker Street, and even the violin seems reluctant to break it. You wake one morning to find Holmes perched in his armchair, coat still on from the night before, his gaze fixed on the fireplace as though he's been there for hours. Perhaps he has. Watson enters, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You haven't been to bed?" he says. Holmes gives a thin smile. "Sleep is a habit, not a necessity." He taps his temple lightly. "I have been thinking." Watson sighs, already wary. "About what this time?" Holmes turns his eyes toward the window. "About London." You glance outside. It's the same city as always. Chimneys exhaling smoke, carriages trundling, street vendors shouting about oysters and evening editions. But Holmes sees something else, something beneath the noise. This city, he says softly, is a living organism. Arteries of streets, lungs of parks, a brain made of parliament and banks. And within it move germs of crime, some harmless, some deadly. I intend to chart them. Watson frowns. Chart them? You mean make a map? Holmes nods, a faint glimmer of delight lighting his tired eyes. Exactly. Imagine, Watson, a cartography of wrongdoing. Every case, every pattern, every pulse of vice marked and measured. Someday the police will follow such maps as they now follow timetables. You can't help but think he's describing something far ahead of his time. Data analysis before data exists. He's not simply solving crimes anymore. He's trying to predict them. Watson chuckles. You'll be the death of yourself, Holmes. Unlikely, Holmes says. Boredom will get there first. In the days that follow, the apartment fills with stacks of newspapers, ledgers, maps. Holmes marks them with pins and threads, building what looks like the skeleton of some vast insect across the wall. Red threads for murder, blue for theft, yellow for deception. From the chaos, you can see the outlines of patterns emerging. Neighborhoods where thefts cluster like fever spots. Back alleys where crimes repeat in eerie cycles. Watson watches the progress in both fascination and concern. "Do you ever tire of looking for darkness?" he asks one night. Holmes doesn't answer immediately. He leans over the map, tracing a line from Whitechapel to the docks. "Darkness," he says finally, "is not the enemy, Watson. Ignorance is. I merely illuminate what others prefer to ignore." He steps back, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "And look, see how predictable it all is. Humanity, my friend, is the most consistent machine ever built." Watson shakes his head. "I'd rather think of people as human. Then you'll never solve them," Holmes murmurs. You can tell Watson doesn't like that answer, but he also knows it's what makes Holmes who he is. A few nights later, as rain beats against the window, a new visitor arrives. A nervous young man clutching his hat as though it might save him from despair. "Mr. Holmes," he stammers. "It's my employer, Sir Eustace Brackenstall. He's dead, sir, murdered. And they say the lady did it." Holmes gestures calmly to the chair. "Sit down and tell me everything you've not already told the police." The man hesitates. "Not told them? But I've told them all." "Then start again," Holmes interrupts, "and leave out nothing this time." As the young man speaks, haltingly, desperately, Holmes listens with half-lidded eyes, fingers steepled beneath his chin. You can see the machine in his head, whirring, slotting each word into place. When the story ends, he stands and reaches for his hat. "Watson, fetch your coat. A murder is always clearer in candlelight than in recollection." You travel with them through the storm to the Brackenstall estate, a grand and lonely house standing like a ghost above the Surrey hills. The scent of damp wood and roses fills the entryway. A maid leads you to the drawing room, where Lady Brackenstall sits pale and trembling beside a half-empty decanter. Her face is bruised, her voice steady. "My husband came home drunk. There was an argument. He struck me, as he often did. Then, I remember little. The servants found him dead. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I did not kill him." Holmes says nothing for a long while. He walks slowly around the room, his eyes moving from the broken wine glass to the fireplace, to the length of rope coiled neatly on the hearth. Then he crouches beside a small patch of wax on the rug. A candle overturned, yet no mark of fire. Curious. He looks up. "Watson, examine this rope. It's been cut recently. See the frayed ends?" Watson nods. "Yes, by a sharp blade." Holmes smiles faintly. "By a sailor's knife, to be precise. And this," he holds up a glimmering thread, "is a strand of naval cord. Our killer was no servant, no burglar. He was a seaman." Watson blinks. "A seaman? Then the lady protected him," Holmes finishes. "And quite right, too." He turns to Lady Brackenstall, eyes gentle now. "He was your first love, was he not? Before your unhappy marriage." She gasps, color rising in her cheeks. "How could you possibly know that?" Holmes merely gestures toward the mantel. "Because the photograph of your youth is turned to face the wall. We hide what still matters. The truth unravels quietly after that. The sailor lover, the cruel husband, the accident, or near enough to one." Holmes keeps his word and says nothing to the police. "Justice," he says softly on the train home, "is not always a matter for law." Back at Baker Street, the rain has stopped. Holmes sits by the window, watching dawn creep across the rooftops. Watson paces. "You risked your reputation to protect her." Holmes shrugs. "My reputation belongs to the newspapers, not to me." Watson stops. "You don't believe in the law?" "Oh, I believe in it," Holmes says, eyes distant. "I simply believe more in reason. The law is a net designed for fish. I prefer to study the water." It's one of those remarks that sounds simple until you think about it. And then it won't leave your mind for days. Weeks pass. London's rhythms return. Holmes takes smaller cases. A missing brooch, a forged letter, a blackmail attempt thwarted before it begins. He moves through them like a chess master replaying easy matches, half engaged, half elsewhere. One morning, Watson receives a letter of his own. News that his medical practice has grown, that he's to marry a patient he once treated, a kind and intelligent woman named Mary Morstan. Holmes congratulates him with genuine warmth, though you sense a flicker of something behind his eyes. Loneliness, perhaps, or pride disguised as indifference. "You will be happier than I could ever make you," he says. Watson smiles awkwardly. "You make it sound as if you're giving me away." "In a sense, I am," Holmes replies. "Marriage is the one adventure I have no talent for." You can tell he means it, though not unkindly. For Holmes, companionship has always been about intellect, not emotion. Still, when Watson leaves that evening to dine with Mary, the silence that fills 221B feels almost too heavy. Holmes sits alone in his chair, violin untouched, eyes distant. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmurs. The heart, that most illogical of instruments, continues to dictate the movements of the world. He leans back, closing his eyes. "I almost admire it. Over the next months, you visit less often. But whenever you do, Baker Street remains exactly as it was. The smell of tobacco, the clutter of papers, the skull with a candle in it. Time doesn't seem to touch the room. Holmes is usually deep in thought or mid-experiment, or explaining to a terrified client how their missing necklace can be found by tracing the footsteps of a stray goose. He never changes, except for small moments when you catch him looking toward Watson's empty chair. One evening, you ask quietly, "Do you miss him?" Holmes looks up, expression unreadable. "Miss him? No. But his absence creates an inefficiency." You smile. "That sounds like yes." Holmes's mouth twitches, almost a smile. Observation suits you. And then, just as quietly as it left, chaos returns. A man in a black coat appears at Baker Street one afternoon, carrying a cane tipped with silver. He introduces himself as a messenger from the Foreign Office. "There's trouble brewing, Mr. Holmes. Stolen papers, international intrigue. We need discretion." Holmes listens, motionless. "Discretion," he says finally, "is merely another word for silence purchased by fear. But very well. Tell me everything." The man hesitates, lowers his voice. "The theft involves more than documents. We believe there's an organization behind it, something vast, unseen, connecting half the crimes in London." Holmes's eyes flicker with sudden light. "An organization, you say? How delightful!" Watson would have groaned at that word. You just feel the temperature in the room drop slightly, because you can tell, in that moment, that Holmes has just met the idea that will haunt him for years to come. A mind equal to his own, perhaps greater. Somewhere in the city, unseen and patient, another spider begins to stir in the web. You awaken to the sound of footsteps pacing over creaking floorboards, the unmistakable rhythm of a restless mind. It's early, still gray outside, the fog thin as lace against the window. Sherlock Holmes stands by the fireplace, half-dressed, pipe in one hand, violin in the other. He's trying to play, but the notes come out uneven, distracted. Something's wrong. You can feel it in the air, the way London feels before a storm. Watson, just arrived, sets his hat on the table. "You've been at it since midnight, haven't you?" Holmes doesn't answer. He drops the bow and starts rifling through a stack of letters. "Watson, Do you recall our conversation about the pattern of crime in London? Watson nods cautiously. Your cartography of wrongdoing? Yes, Holmes says, eyes gleaming. The map grows, and I've found something curious. He spreads the papers across the table. See here. Smuggling in the docks, counterfeiting in Southwark, extortion in Soho. Unconnected crimes, so they seem. But trace the dates, trace the names, and you find a single thread. A man at the center. Professor James Moriarty. He says the name quietly, as if it might hear him. Watson frowns. A professor? Of what? Mathematics, Holmes says, with a mixture of admiration and distaste. But mathematics, my dear Watson, is merely the study of pattern. And pattern is the architecture of crime. That's how it begins. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper. For weeks, Holmes talks of little else. The name surfaces everywhere, in police reports, in gossip, in coded letters intercepted from smugglers. Holmes starts to describe Moriarty not just as a man, but as a system. He's the Napoleon of crime. He tells Watson one evening, pacing the length of the room. He sits quietly in the shadows, weaving an invisible web that stretches across Europe. Every criminal act of consequence traces back to him. Thieves, assassins, forgers, all working like clockwork under his command. And yet no one knows his face. Watson leans forward. You've met him? Holmes stops pacing. Once, briefly. He doesn't elaborate, but the look in his eyes says enough. Whatever passed between them wasn't merely professional. It was personal, as if two mirrors had been forced to stare into each other. You sense in Holmes a rare emotion. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The days grow darker. Holmes grows stranger. He starts disappearing for hours, sometimes days, returning with mud on his boots and scratches on his hands. He eats little, sleeps less, muttering under his breath about ciphers and networks and threads in the web. Watson grows worried. You're driving yourself into the ground, Holmes. Let the police handle it. The police? Holmes scoffs. They see only the spider's prey. I see the web itself. Still, the toll shows. You catch him one morning staring at his reflection in the window, the lines on his face sharper than you remember. He's watching me, he murmurs, voice barely audible. He knows I'm close. Watson tries to reassure him, but you know what he really means. Moriarty isn't a case anymore. He's an obsession, and obsession is dangerous, even for Sherlock Holmes. Then, one bleak morning in April, the storm finally breaks. Holmes bursts into Baker Street, coat torn, face flushed with triumph. Watson, pack a bag. We must leave London at once. Watson blinks. Leave? Why? Because, Holmes says, Professor Moriarty has decided I've lived long enough. You feel the room still. Outside, carriages roll by as if nothing's changed. Inside, the air vibrates with tension. Holmes locks the door, checks the window, then sits at the table with a calmness so precise, it's frightening. He cornered me at the Midland Hotel, Holmes says. Polite, cordial, deadly. Offered me a bargain, cease my investigation, and he would spare my life. I declined. Watson stares. Holmes, he set his men upon me. Holmes continues. We have only hours before they strike. Therefore, we vanish. And just like that, the decision is made. You follow them across England by train, the countryside rolling past in streaks of green and gray. Holmes sits silent most of the way, occasionally scribbling notes in his pocketbook. Watson tries to lighten the mood, but Holmes only mutters, The final problem, Watson. The last and the greatest. When you arrive in Dover, the air smells of salt and seaweed. The sky is vast and pale, the channel like a sheet of hammered glass. Holmes leads the way aboard a ferry to France. On deck, as the ship cuts through choppy waves, Watson finally asks, What happens when you find him? Holmes's answer is quiet. Then I'll have peace. Watson frowns. And afterward? Holmes exhales smoke into the wind. There is no afterward. The words fall heavy between you, carried away by the sea. From France to Switzerland, the journey feels like exile. Holmes keeps ahead of something you can't see. Men in dark coats glimpsed at train stations, strange eyes in mirrors, coded telegrams arriving without signatures. Finally, they reach the alpine town of Meiringen. Snow caps the mountains, rivers sparkle with glacial light. It's beautiful, unreal, a place that feels untouched by crime or city or consequence. Holmes seems almost peaceful here. For the first time in weeks, he sleeps soundly. He and Watson walk along the hills, speaking of old cases, of music, of small, ordinary things. But the peace doesn't last. One morning, a message arrives. Urgent. A woman in distress nearby, begging Holmes for help. He hesitates, then agrees to go. Wait for me at the inn, he tells Watson. I'll be back by evening. But something in his voice betrays him. It's too calm, too final. Watson insists on accompanying him, but Holmes shakes his head. No, my friend. There are some paths that must be walked alone. He clasps Watson's hand briefly, almost tenderly. You've been my chronicler, my companion, my conscience. Thank you. Then he walks away, coat billowing like a shadow across the snow. Hours later, Watson receives another note, this one false, summoning him to a supposed emergency at the hotel. When he returns, breathless and furious at the deception, Holmes is gone. The innkeeper tells him he's gone to the Reichenbach Falls. Watson follows the trail through pines and mist, the roar of water growing louder with each step. When he reaches the gorge, he sees the scene as if frozen in time. The footprints, the scuff marks, the shattered rock at the edge. And there, Holmes's hat. Pinned beneath a stone, a note flaps in the spray. Watson lifts it with trembling hands. My dear Watson, it reads, I had reason to believe that the professor's agents would never permit us both to leave this place alive. I must therefore choose my ground. Please convey my compliments to the inspector and my gratitude for your loyalty. I think of you always as the best and wisest of men. Below, the handwriting trails off, smudged by rain. Watson looks up and sees them. Two figures far out on the narrow ledge, locked in combat. One tall and thin, the other broad and stooped. For a moment they struggle, silhouettes against the white fury of the falls. Then both topple, vanishing into the abyss. The roar of the waterfall drowns everything. For hours, Watson searches, calling out until his voice breaks. But the mist answers only with silence. There are no bodies, no footprints, only the endless plunge of water and the echo of a life disappearing into legend. When he finally returns to London alone, the city feels changed. Baker Street is dark, dust gathering where laughter used to be. Mrs. Hudson weeps softly when she opens the door. Watson sits by the empty chair, staring at the pipe still resting on the mantel. He writes the story of that final confrontation, calling it The Adventure of the Final Problem. When it's published, readers across the world mourn as if a real man has died. They send flowers to 221B. Letters addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, detective in heaven. Some even demand the government raise a monument. Holmes, of course, would have called it absurd. But Watson writes anyway, because someone must keep the memory alive. And so, the legend deepens. Time passes. Years slip by. Watson grows older, his practice flourishes, his wife's laughter fills the home. Yet sometimes, when the fog rolls over London just right, he thinks he hears a violin drifting from the distance. And somewhere, far from the city, perhaps in a monastery, perhaps in a hidden corner of the world, a tall man in a long coat walks quietly among strangers, eyes sharp, smile faint. He listens to the news of Europe, takes notes on the patterns of crime, and waits, because a man like Holmes does not die in silence. He simply recedes into shadow, preparing, always, for the next deduction. The world believes him gone, but the truth, like him, never quite stays buried. The years after the Reichenbach Falls pass like a long, gray dream. London continues to move, but it moves differently now. Slower, quieter, as if a particular heartbeat has gone missing. The hansom cabs still clatter down Baker Street. The lamplighters still make their rounds at dusk. But for Dr. Watson, the city feels hollow, like a stage after the curtain has fallen. Everywhere he goes, he feels the absence. There's no pipe smoke curling from the upstairs window of 221B. No violin echoing faintly at midnight. No sudden telegrams announcing some new adventure. Holmes's things remain untouched. His books, his files, even the Persian slippers stuffed with tobacco. But without him, they look like relics in a museum. Watson writes, of course, it's all he can do. The final problem is read across continents, translated into half a dozen languages. Readers send him condolences, as though Holmes were a fallen soldier. He appreciates the letters, but none of them fill the silence. Sometimes, late at night, Watson walks the foggy streets alone, half expecting to see a tall figure stepping out of the mist, hat tilted low, eyes alight with some new deduction. But the figure never comes. It's been 3 years. 3 long years since Holmes and Professor Moriarty vanished into that torrent of white water at Reichenbach. And though the world has moved on, Watson still can't. Then, one April afternoon, something extraordinary happens. Watson is in his consulting room, listening to the complaints of a nervous patient, when a familiar shadow passes the frosted glass door. It's gone in a blink, but something inside him freezes. He excuses himself mid-sentence, opens the door, and there stands a figure he hasn't seen since Switzerland. Tall, lean, gray at the temples, the same piercing eyes. Good heavens, Watson whispers. It can't be. But it is. Sherlock Holmes stands before him, alive and calm, as though he's merely been out for a walk. My dear Watson, he says with that infuriating composure, I had the strongest conviction you would survive your shock. Watson doesn't move for several seconds, then rushes forward, gripping Holmes by the arms. Alive after 3 years? Do you have any idea? Approximately 7. Holmes interrupts mildly. Judging by your weight, your complexion, and the state of your cuffs. Watson stares at him, then laughs despite himself. You haven't changed at all. On the contrary, Holmes says, I've changed in every way that matters. That night, back at Baker Street, the old flat feels suddenly alive again. The fire crackles. The dust is swept away. The very air seems to hum with purpose. Holmes sits by the window, recounting the impossible story of his survival. When I fell with Moriarty, he begins, I knew we were evenly matched. My only chance was to use his own momentum. At the edge of the falls, I allowed him to grapple me. Then I twisted, breaking his hold at the last moment. He fell. I clung to the rock. The rest, as they say, is gravity. Watson's eyes widen. You climbed down the cliff? Holmes shrugs. A trifle. My fingers were somewhat numb afterward, but it was necessary. I hid for months, then years. Traveling as a Norwegian explorer, a Tibetan scholar, a sailor. I needed Moriarty's network to believe I was dead. And it worked. Watson shakes his head, still half disbelieving. All this time, you let the world mourn you? It was the only way to dismantle his web, Holmes replies. A living man is pursued, a dead one is ignored. He leans back, his gaze distant. "And now, my dear Watson, the world requires me once more." The reunion spreads quickly through London like a rumor that refuses to die. One by one, old clients reappear, each with new mysteries. Inspector Lestrade drops by with a grin and a handshake. "Blast it, Holmes. We thought you'd gone to join the angels." Holmes smirks. "I prefer my company terrestrial." Soon, the rhythm of the old days returns. The smell of tobacco, the endless stream of visitors, the laughter that Watson didn't realize he'd missed so much. Yet something about Holmes is different now. There's a stillness to him, a gravity. The man who once lived for the thrill of the chase now moves with purpose rather than restlessness. He still plays the violin, but the melodies are gentler. Less storm, more thought. He even eats better. Watson notes all this in his journal, adding one small, unscientific observation. He seems happy. Their first case after Holmes's resurrection comes almost immediately. The adventure of the empty house. A nobleman, Ronald Adair, found shot dead in his locked study. No weapon, no signs of struggle, no clue at all. The newspapers call it another London mystery. But Holmes knows better. "The professor may be gone," he tells Watson, "but the web remains." They visit the scene together. The room smells faintly of tobacco and gunpowder. Holmes moves like a shadow, scanning every detail. His gaze lingers on a small window latch. "Watson," he says softly, "our killer is not in the house. He's outside it." "How could that be?" "Because," Holmes says, "the bullet's angle tells us it came from across the street. Observe the indentation on the windowsill. Sharpshooter's work. The man we seek is Colonel Moran, once Moriarty's right hand." That evening, they lay a trap. Holmes leaves a wax dummy of himself visible through the window of Baker Street, perfectly positioned for an assassin's aim. Then, as night deepens, he and Watson wait in silence behind a screen. When the shot finally cracks through the air, it sounds like thunder. Holmes moves before the echo dies, lunging toward the opposite building. Moments later, the police drag in a furious, red-faced man clutching a custom rifle. "Colonel Sebastian Moran," Holmes announces. "The second most dangerous man in London. The first, as you know, fell at Reichenbach." That night, Watson toasts Holmes's return. "You've done it again," he says, smiling. "London's nightmare is over." Holmes shakes his head. "Nightmares never end, my dear Watson. They only change shape." He turns toward the window, where the fog presses against the glass. "There will always be another mind waiting to test its limits. Another puzzle to be solved. I simply provide the courtesy of an opponent." It sounds almost melancholy, but then that's Holmes. Half scientist, half philosopher, all contradiction. Over the next few years, the adventures continue. Each case a small masterpiece of deduction and drama. The dancing men, the Norwood builder, the solitary cyclist, the 6 Napoleons. Each one begins the same. A client in distress, a clue too small for anyone else to notice, and Holmes transforming chaos into clarity. Yet behind the brilliance, you sense time catching up with him. He's slower to rise in the mornings. His hands tremble slightly when he lights his pipe. Watson teases him about it. "Perhaps even you can't outrun age, old friend." Holmes smiles. "Age is merely another disguise. I wear it well, don't you think?" And he does. Elegantly, defiantly. Still, you can tell he's thinking of something else now. Not just solving mysteries, but meaning. Each case seems to bring him closer to a quiet reckoning, a question he never asked before. What is a mind like his meant to do when there are no more puzzles left? One winter evening, as snow falls softly against the windows, Holmes surprises Watson with an announcement. "I'm retiring," he says simply. Watson nearly drops his tea. Retiring. You? Holmes chuckles. It appears even logic requires rest. I've purchased a small cottage in Sussex. Bees, not burglars, will occupy my attention. Watson blinks, half certain it's a joke. But Holmes's expression is serene. The human mind, Watson, is a violin string. Play it too long and it snaps. Watson shakes his head. You'll be back in a month. Holmes smiles faintly. Perhaps. But if not, then let this be enough. I have seen the best and worst of mankind, and I remain cautiously optimistic about the outcome. He raises his glass. To the next mystery, whatever form it takes. They drink in silence, watching the snow blur the world outside into something pure and new. The next morning, Holmes is gone. A short note lies on the table, written in his sharp, precise hand. My dear Watson, the world will always be full of riddles. You needn't chase them all. Some are meant simply to be admired. Watson folds the letter carefully, places it in his pocket, and looks around the empty room. The pipe is gone, the violin case too. But somehow, the space feels full. Not of absence, but of presence. As though Holmes has merely stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. And maybe he will. After all, in London, even ghosts have habits. Months later, a stranger in Sussex writes to the Times. Local beekeeper, tall, eccentric, plays the violin to his hives. Watson smiles when he reads it. Holmes has found peace, at least for now. But deep down, you suspect that peace, for him, is simply another kind of puzzle, one he's still learning to solve. You find yourself years later on a quiet country lane in Sussex, where the air smells of honey and heather. The city feels like another lifetime. Here, the rhythm is slower. Bees hum in the gardens, wind stirs through tall grass, and the only smoke curling from the chimney belongs not to London's industry, but to a small stone cottage on a hill. Inside that cottage, Sherlock Holmes lives, or rather, exists, like a scientist inside a terrarium of his own design. Gone are the telegrams, the visitors, the clamor of the city. Instead, bees, thousands of them. They are his new experiment, his new riddle. You watch him move among the hives, calm and deliberate, dressed in a straw hat and veil. His long fingers move with the same precision that once lifted fingerprints from revolver handles. The buzzing rises and falls around him like applause. Holmes tilts one of the frames toward the sunlight. Remarkable creatures, he murmurs. Entire societies built on logic, hierarchy, and labor. No lies, no vanity, no confusion. The ideal civilization. Watson, who has come to visit, chuckles softly. And yet you keep stealing their honey. Holmes glances at him. Even paradise has taxes? The doctor smiles, shaking his head. You seem well. I am, Holmes replies. Perfectly so. The mind, when deprived of chaos, begins to heal. Or to rot. I haven't yet decided which. You can tell he's only half joking. Life in Sussex suits him, though not in the way one might imagine. He still keeps his books in order, his papers meticulously filed. He still writes in coded shorthand, still experiments with chemicals that occasionally set off alarming hisses and pops. But there's a softness to him now. He walks slower, speaks gentler, even laughs more easily. He keeps a dog, an old hound named Toby II, successor to the original Toby from the Sign of Four. The dog naps by the hearth while Holmes reads aloud to the bees. Watson visits often, bringing newspapers and gossip from the city. They still speak of you, he tells him one afternoon, settling into the armchair by the fire. There's a whole new generation of detectives trying to be the next Sherlock Holmes. Holmes smirks faintly. How unfortunate for them. There is only one of me, and even I barely tolerate it. But beneath the humor, you sense something else. a flicker of nostalgia, maybe even longing. For all his talk of peace, Holmes was never built for stillness. His mind, like his bees, needs motion to survive. And so, inevitably, motion returns. It starts one spring morning with a letter sealed in red wax. No name, only an address. Mr. Holmes, beekeeper, Sussex Downs. He opens it at the breakfast table while Watson butters his toast. What does it say? Watson asks. Holmes scans it once, twice. A German code, he says. But an old one, a military cipher if I'm not mistaken. He looks up, the gleam of purpose returning to his eyes. Watson, pack your bag. The government has remembered me. 2 days later, you're in London again. It feels both familiar and strange. The air is thicker, the streets louder. Holmes moves through it like a man walking through his own shadow, half belonging, half ghost. They meet with Mycroft, his brother, at the Diogenes Club. Mycroft looks older, broader, but no less imposing. We've intercepted communications, he says in a low voice. A spy network operating under our very noses. You are the only man capable of untangling it. Holmes nods slowly. Spies, not criminals. Lies without corpses. I suppose I can endure that. Watson raises an eyebrow. You speak as if you're already weary of it. Holmes smiles faintly. I am, but one must occasionally stretch the intellect, lest it become domesticated. The case leads them into a world of coded messages, secret ink, and identities that vanish like smoke. A German agent known only as von Bork has been smuggling naval intelligence out of Britain. Holmes, returning to his old brilliance, disguises himself as an Irish-American mechanic to infiltrate the ring. Watson watches, amused, as Holmes limps about with a false beard and a working man's accent so convincing even he forgets it's an act. The final trap unfolds in a quiet country house near Harwich. As von Bork opens what he believes to be his final delivery, a case of secret naval plans, Holmes drops the pretense, standing tall once more. You will find, sir, he says coolly, that the only thing inside is disappointment. The case bursts open, not with documents, but with a single volume labeled Practical Handbook of Bee Culture. Von Bork's face drains of color. You? Holmes smiles. Yes, me. It's over in minutes. The agent is arrested, the intelligence recovered, and England saved from embarrassment. Later, as the police cart von Bork away, Holmes dusts off his coat. It seems retirement was premature. Watson laughs. You never could resist a good deception. On the contrary, Holmes says, I resist them constantly. I merely fail spectacularly now and then. Back in Sussex, the hives hum as though nothing happened. Holmes watches them thoughtfully. The bees thrive, he says. They neither know nor care that their keeper just prevented a war. Watson smiles. Then perhaps they're wiser than we are. Holmes tilts his head. Perhaps. Or simply more focused. You sense, though, that this case has rekindled something in him. A spark of the man who once saw the world as an endless puzzle. But unlike before, the fire doesn't consume him. It warms him instead. He's older now, yes, but sharper in a quieter way. Like a blade honed by restraint rather than fury. Sometimes he takes long walks at dusk, cane tapping softly against the stone path. The sunset spills gold across the hills, and for a moment he looks peaceful, content even. You can almost believe he's truly retired this time. But when you follow him back to the cottage, you notice something new. A locked drawer in his desk. Watson has asked about it more than once, and Holmes always deflects. Merely correspondence, he says. Nothing of importance. Of course, that means it's something very important. One night, after Holmes has gone to bed, you notice him wake again around midnight. He unlocks the drawer, takes out a small leather folder, and opens it carefully. Inside is a single photograph, worn at the edges. Irene Adler. He studies it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he sighs, replaces it gently, and locks the drawer once more. Some mysteries, it seems, even he prefers unsolved. As the years continue, Holmes receives the occasional letter from London. Invitations to lectures, to honors, to commemorations. He declines them all. "The moment I'm labeled a legend," he says, "I'll be obliged to stop thinking." Instead, he writes small essays on logic, observation, and the psychology of bees. One of them, Watson notes proudly, becomes required reading for Scotland Yard recruits. He also teaches a handful of students, young men and women who visit him in secret to learn the art of deduction. Most fail, of course, but one or two leave with a glimmer of understanding. The trick, Holmes tells them, is not to see more, but to see better. Observation without empathy is blindness of another sort. It's a surprising sentiment, coming from him. Perhaps age has softened his edges, or perhaps the bees have taught him more about society than humans ever could. One morning, Watson visits again. He finds Holmes seated outside, coat draped over his shoulders, watching the sun rise through a thin veil of mist. "You're up early?" Watson says. Holmes smiles faintly. Old men wake early. There's less future to waste. They sit together in silence, listening to the bees. After a long while, Watson speaks. "Do you ever regret it? The years spent chasing criminals, the solitude, the danger?" Holmes shakes his head. "Regret is an inefficient emotion. I do, however, indulge in reflection." He looks toward the hills, where the light is spilling brighter now. "If I have learned anything, Watson, it is that truth is rarely comfortable, but always necessary. And that friendship, unlike reason, cannot be deduced. It must be accepted." Watson smiles softly. "You're sentimental in your old age." "Sentimental?" Holmes replies, half amused. "Nonsense. I'm simply human." When Watson leaves later that day, Holmes remains in the garden, the sound of bees wrapping around him like music. You stand beside him, unseen, as he closes his eyes and lets the sunlight touch his face. In that moment, you understand. This is what peace looks like for him. Not silence, but harmony. Not the absence of puzzles, but the acceptance that some mysteries are meant to endure. And somewhere, far away, London still breathes, waiting for its detective to return. But for now, he lets the world move on without him. He has his bees, he has his peace, and finally, he has himself. You begin this chapter of Holmes's life not in the bustle of Baker Street or the quiet hum of Sussex, but somewhere in between, where time starts to blur and memories turn into their own kind of mystery. The man who once mapped the criminal mind now spends his mornings mapping the clouds. The man who chased chaos across continents now pauses to watch a bee land perfectly on a lavender stem. It's peaceful, almost too peaceful. The years have softened his face, though not his mind. His eyes still glint with that same quicksilver intelligence, the same quiet fire. But his body, once taut and restless, has grown slower, more deliberate. He moves like a man learning to live at half speed, and not entirely enjoying it. Watson visits less often now. His health, too, is waning. When he does arrive, the two men sit by the hearth, sharing a brandy and the kind of conversation that requires no words. "You've aged well, Holmes," Watson says one winter evening. Holmes chuckles, his voice gravelly but warm. "That's because I avoided marriage." Watson laughs, coughing lightly. "You avoided everything." "Not quite everything," Holmes replies, glancing at the violin propped against the wall. "I indulged in a few vices: deduction, tobacco, and truth." "And the bees?" Watson adds. Holmes smiles faintly. Ah, yes, the bees. They ask no questions. They tell no lies. The perfect company. Despite the calm, there are moments when his old restlessness returns, like wind stirring old dust. He still receives letters, some from admirers, others from desperate souls who somehow learn that the great detective lives among the heather fields. Most he ignores, but one catches his attention. It arrives in the spring, sealed with a strange blue wax. The handwriting is neat, almost unnervingly symmetrical. The letter itself is brief. Mr. Holmes, you may have retired, but one question remains unanswered. It concerns the professor you vanquished long ago and what he left behind. Meet me where the cliffs watch the sea and bring your reason with you. A friend of the late professor. Holmes reads it twice, then 3 times. His expression doesn't change, but you feel the old spark flicker to life. Watson notices too. You're not thinking of going, he says, though he already knows the answer. I am, Holmes replies quietly, because the moment I stop thinking, I stop being. And so, the journey begins again. The cliffs lie 2 days' travel from Sussex, near the northern coast. Rugged, wind-beaten, and desolate. Holmes travels light, taking only his notebook, his revolver, and a small pouch of tobacco. The sea greets him like an old adversary, cold, immense, untamed. He walks along the edge of the cliff path, coat whipping in the wind. The smell of salt and wild thyme fills the air. A lone figure waits ahead, standing beside a weathered stone arch. The stranger wears a dark coat, face half shadowed by the setting sun. You received my letter, the man says. His accent is faintly German, precise, clipped. I wasn't sure you would come. Holmes's eyes narrow. And yet, here I am. You claim acquaintance with Professor Moriarty? I claim inheritance, the man replies. My name is Karl Hoffner. The professor was my mentor. He left me his papers before he died, mathematical proofs, criminal models, correspondences with you. Holmes raises an eyebrow. Then you know he was a murderer. Hoffner nods. And you were his equal. The wind howls through the rocks, tugging at their coats. I didn't come to fight, Hoffner continues. I came to finish his work, the pure work, to prove that crime can be predicted, modeled, controlled, like chemistry. Holmes's voice is calm, but his eyes flash. Controlled by whom? Hoffner smiles thinly. By the ones clever enough to understand it. People like him. People like you. For a long moment, Holmes says nothing. You can almost see the thoughts sparking behind his eyes like flint against steel. Then he speaks softly. You misunderstand me, Mr. Hoffner. I studied crime to prevent it, not to command it. But what's the difference? Hoffner asks. You classify men, their motives, their methods. You predict their actions. You have spent your life proving that morality is an equation. The professor merely accepted it. Holmes steps closer, voice low but steady. The difference is choice. You and your mentor sought control. I sought understanding. Hoffner's expression hardens. And what is understanding worth without power? Holmes exhales slowly, glancing toward the sea. It keeps one human. The argument ends not with violence, but with silence. Hoffner, realizing he will not convert his idol, turns away. Then you've wasted your gift, he says bitterly. Holmes watches him disappear into the fog. When he's gone, Holmes stands for a long time at the cliff's edge, listening to the waves crash below. You can't tell if he's victorious or weary, or both. He returns to Sussex a few days later, thinner, quieter. Watson meets him at the station, cane in hand. You've been somewhere dangerous, Watson says. Holmes smiles faintly. Everywhere is dangerous when one listens too closely to the world. He doesn't mention the name Hoffner again, but something has changed. He writes more, filling notebooks with thoughts on ethics, logic, and the limits of deduction. You catch glimpses of titles. On the fallibility of the human equation, the shadow of certainty. He no longer seeks cases. Instead, he begins studying himself. In the evenings, when the air turns cool, he takes long walks with Watson through the downs. The doctor has aged more visibly, hair silver, gait slower. But the two men remain an unbreakable pair. Sometimes they speak of old cases. "Do you ever miss it?" Watson asks one night, their silhouettes etched against a fading sky. Holmes smiles wistfully. "Miss it? I live it, Watson. Every bee that strays from its hive reminds me of a clue missed. Every gust of wind that shifts direction reminds me of a motive misunderstood." Watson laughs softly. "Even now you can't stop deducing." "I can't stop observing," Holmes corrects. The difference is subtle, but essential. They walk on in comfortable silence, the grass whispering beneath their boots. Finally, Holmes adds, almost to himself, "The world is simpler when one no longer needs to solve it." That night, Holmes sits by his desk, the lamplight flickering across his face. You notice the weariness in his eyes, but also something gentler. A kind of peace earned, not found. He writes in his journal, "It has taken me 70 years to realize that the mind, like a hive, thrives not on perfection, but on purpose. I once believed truth to be a sharp instrument. Now I see it as a living organism, complex, mutable, necessary. I am no longer certain of everything. And that, perhaps, is certainty enough." He closes the book, sets it aside, and turns toward the window. Outside, the moonlight drifts over the hives. The bees, even in darkness, continue their quiet labor. Holmes smiles. "Industry without ambition," he murmurs. "How enviable." Watson passes away the following winter. His final note to Holmes is short, affectionate, written in his shaky hand. "My dear friend, if heaven is logical, you'll arrive late and find me waiting. Until then, keep the world in order." Holmes reads it once, then places it beside Irene Adler's photograph in the locked drawer. Two fragments of a life, one of love, one of friendship. He keeps them there always. In his final years, Holmes becomes something of a myth again. Travelers whisper of a hermit beekeeper with eyes like knives. Children in the nearby village leave small puzzles and riddles at his gate, delighted when they find the answers returned neatly the next morning. He no longer ventures far from home. His hair is white now, his hands thin as paper. Yet his mind remains incandescent. Visitors describe conversations with him as like standing too close to lightning, illuminating and slightly dangerous. When asked if he still believes in deduction, he smiles. "I believe in observation," he says. Deduction was merely its language on the final evening of his life, though, of course, he doesn't know it's final. Holmes walks out into the garden at sunset. The air hums with bees and memory. He sits on a small bench and closes his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, he hears a violin. Not real, but remembered. It's playing the same gentle tune he once played for Irene Adler, for Watson, for himself. And as the last light fades, you hear him whisper, almost content. Elementary, always was. The wind carries it away. The bees keep working. The world, as it always does, continues. But somewhere, perhaps in the warm flicker of a lamplight, or in the careful turn of a curious mind, the great detective still lingers, solving the mysteries that never end. Time folds in strange ways after Holmes's passing. The cottage in Sussex remains. The bees still hum, the air still smells faintly of smoke and heather. But without its master, the space feels almost too still. Neighbors walk past in hushed tones, some tipping their hats as if the man might step out at any moment to correct their posture or question their deduction. And in a sense, he does. Because Sherlock Holmes never really leaves. He becomes something larger, stranger, an echo, an inheritance. It begins quietly. A publisher in London prints a memorial collection of Dr. Watson's stories, including several drafts found among his papers. The book sells instantly. Readers devour it. They write letters to the Strand magazine, begging for more, insisting that Holmes must have survived again. Children play detective in the alleys, mimicking the way he twirls his cane or peers down at footprints. Scientists quote his lines about observation. Policemen claim to have studied under him. His words, "When you have eliminated the impossible," become as common as scripture. The myth grows legs, then lungs, then an immortal pulse. You're there, in a sense, watching it happen. You walk through late Victorian London, noticing how Holmes's shadow lengthens across the city like twilight, seeping into novels, plays, even advertisements. A theater on the Strand stages Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, starring an actor named William Gillette. You can see him from the stalls, tall, graceful with that same steepled hand posture and hawk-like gaze. When the curtains part and Gillette raises his pipe, the audience gasps. For a heartbeat, they believe he's truly returned. Holmes, of course, would have hated it. Too sentimental by half. And yet, perhaps, he would have smiled privately at the performance's precision. Gillette, before taking the stage, famously telegrams Arthur Conan Doyle to ask, "May I marry Holmes in the play?" Doyle replies, "You may marry him, murder him, or do what you like with him." And so Holmes falls in love. On stage, at least. A fiction within a fiction, echoing Irene Adler's Ghost. The audience loves it. The newspapers call it a resurrection. But while London claps for its stage Holmes, across the sea another rebirth begins. American publishers reprint the entire canon, binding it in leather with gilt lettering. The Complete Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The books cross oceans, finding their way into libraries, classrooms, soldiers' duffel bags. Children in India read about the fog of Baker Street. Students in Tokyo debate whether Holmes could have existed. A doctor in Buenos Aires claims to use Holmesian deduction to diagnose his patients. And through it all, one strange paradox persists. The world believes Holmes is real. Even decades later, readers write letters to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. Some thank him for saving imaginary relatives. Some beg for his help. One man even sends a gold watch as payment for services rendered in the matter of my missing brother. Clerks at the Abbey National Building Society, the company that eventually occupies 221B, begin answering the mail on his behalf. They sign their replies, "Yours faithfully, Mrs. Hudson." You can almost hear Holmes laughing. "I told you, Watson," he'd say. Fiction always sounds more convincing than truth. The myth becomes reality, and the reality becomes myth. The great detective steps off the page, crosses into the world, and refuses to leave. By the early 20th century, the world has changed. London's carriages are replaced by motor cars. Gaslight gives way to electricity. Empires tremble. Wars burn continents. And yet, Sherlock Holmes endures. Because he is more than a man now, he is an idea. The detective who sees what others miss. The scientist who believes in reason even when the world turns mad. The friend who reminds us that intellect, without compassion, is just another kind of blindness. You visit Baker Street again, years after his supposed death. The address is crowded with tourists, scholars, and dreamers. A museum now fills the rooms once imagined into being. The pipe, the violin, the Persian slipper, the magnifying glass. You stand in the doorway, half expecting Holmes to look up from his chair, say something sharp but kind. "Ah, you're late." The game has already begun. But instead there's silence. Just the creak of floorboards and the soft ticking of a clock that no longer marks real time. Still, the illusion holds. You can almost smell the tobacco. The world has kept his ghost alive, down to the very scent of ash and mystery. Outside, a school group passes by. The guide, dressed in a deerstalker cap, recites lines with theatrical precision. "Elementary, my dear Watson." The children giggle, unaware that Holmes never actually said those exact words. But the misquote doesn't matter. In myths, the details evolve until they feel truer than the truth. Meanwhile, Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Holmes, spends his later years chasing ghosts of another kind. He turns from logic to spiritualism, seeking proof of the afterlife. The irony doesn't escape anyone. The creator of the world's most rational mind becomes obsessed with seances and fairies. Critics call it a contradiction. But maybe it isn't. Maybe Doyle, like Holmes, was always searching for patterns. Only now he's searching for them beyond death. And in a way, he succeeds. Because Holmes does survive death, not just in books or plays, but in imagination itself. Every generation reinvents him. Basil Rathbone's wartime Holmes, fighting Nazis with magnified logic. Jeremy Brett's haunting Victorian Holmes, manic and fragile, almost too human for comfort. Benedict Cumberbatch's modern Holmes, texting and hacking instead of scribbling and smoking. Robert Downey Jr.'s cinematic Holmes, part genius, part fighter, all chaos. And through every version, one truth remains. The mind, the method, the friendship. You sit now in a cinema, decades after the Sussex years, watching another reinvention unfold in flickering light. Holmes on screen moves through fog and gunfire with impossible grace. The audience gasps at every deduction, laughs at every quip. You look around, every face, every age, leaning forward in the same shared wonder. This, you realize, is his final case. How to remain alive in the collective memory of the world. And he solved it, of course, perfectly. But let's step backward for a moment, to the real Holmes, the one who lived and died among bees and books. What would he make of all this? He'd likely dismiss it as sentimental nonsense. The idea of immortality, he'd say, is merely the human refusal to accept statistical probability. And yet, in the privacy of night, he might smile to think that his methods, his relentless logic, had become a kind of comfort for those who seek order in a disorderly world. After all, every time someone asks why, every time someone looks closer instead of assuming, every time someone insists on truth, no matter how small, it's him. He's there. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, that decades after his death, a young constable in Scotland Yard received an anonymous letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in that unmistakable slanted hand. Observe, deduce, understand, forgive. No signature. Just the faint smell of tobacco and the ghost of a smile. They say the constable kept it folded in his notebook for the rest of his life. So you see, Sherlock Holmes never really solved his final case. He became it. A riddle without an answer. A life that proves intellect and empathy can coexist. A story that, once begun, never truly ends. Somewhere, in every city, someone sits in a lamplit room, reading by the edge of sleep, tracing the path of Holmes's logic through London fog. And as they drift toward dreams, they hear that familiar voice again. Cool, amused, unhurried. Come now, look closer. You've missed something obvious. They smile in the dark, turning another page, unable to stop. Because that's the true legacy of the world's only consulting detective. He doesn't let you stop thinking. And perhaps On a quiet night when the rain taps gently at the windows and the mind begins to wander. You too might imagine it. A tall, lean figure walking the streets of a fog-covered London. A violin tune rising faintly from an upstairs window. A voice saying, "Watson, the game's afoot." You turn, expecting to see him vanish around the corner, and maybe, just maybe, you do. Because wherever curiosity survives, Sherlock Holmes endures, not as a man, not even as a legend, but as a question. One we keep asking, again and again. What is truth, and how far are we willing to go to find it? And as long as someone keeps asking, the game, as always, will remain afoot. The years roll forward, and London itself begins to resemble one of Holmes's own case files. Layered, annotated, and always changing. Where horse hooves once clattered, automobiles now rumble. Telegraph wires give way to radio masts. Electricity crawls across the skyline like lightning captured and tamed. The fog still lingers, though it smells faintly of gasoline now, not coal. You walk along Baker Street again, though it's hardly the same. Number 229 stands like a relic amid new buildings. Its brickwork cleaned, its window polished, its door now a museum piece. Inside, tourists shuffle reverently through rooms that once existed only in imagination. They marvel at the violin, the microscope, the tobacco ash index, the Persian slipper. They whisper to each other as if afraid to disturb a sleeping genius. But if you listen closely, past the murmurs and the clicking cameras, there's something else. A faint rhythm, almost like breathing. Perhaps it's the old floorboards sighing, or perhaps it's the city itself remembering him. Holmes would have found all this absurd, of course. A man memorialized by dust and furniture, he would scoff. But even he might have softened at the thought that his methods had survived him, that the world was still learning to think in his image. The 20th century becomes a laboratory for deduction. New sciences emerge: psychology, forensics, criminology, all echoing Holmes's principles of logic and observation. Police departments across the world adopt Holmesian techniques: fingerprinting, chemical residue analysis, reconstruction of crime scenes. In classrooms, professors quote him without irony. Data, data, data. I can't make bricks without clay. Students, once bored by lectures, now take notes feverishly, eager to learn how to see as he saw. To notice the mud on a shoe, the scratch on a ring, the tremor in a voice. The age of the detective becomes the age of modern reasoning. And in this new world, Holmes becomes something stranger still. Not just a literary character, but a blueprint for human curiosity. Meanwhile, Dr. Watson's descendants, fictional or not, continue to publish new editions of his journals. The pages yellow, but the words stay alive. It's always the same miracle, one critic writes. You know how the story ends, and yet you lean forward anyway, and perhaps that's the essence of it. Every mystery, solved or not, is a promise. Holmes never truly offered comfort. What he offered was clarity, the idea that even chaos has a pattern, even madness has a rhythm. It's a comforting illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Because as the decades pass, the world grows faster, messier, harder to reduce to pure logic. Wars erupt that no deduction can prevent. Crimes are committed not for greed or jealousy, but for ideas. If Holmes had lived to see it, he might have found the 20th century distasteful. Too many variables, too few constants. But part of him would have admired it too. A new puzzle, vast and unsolvable. And then something remarkable happens. He adapts. Long after his creator is gone, Holmes evolves. In films, he trades gaslight for electric lamps, telegrams for telephones. In radio plays, His violin becomes a haunting interlude between advertisements. In comic books, he wrestles with villains who wear masks instead of mustaches. The man who once solved murders in London now solves coded transmissions in wartime bunkers, stolen blueprints in industrial America, conspiracies that cross oceans. His mind, it seems, is immortal. Even scholars notice the pattern. Sherlock Holmes, one historian writes, is not bound by the century that birthed him. He is logic wearing whatever century's clothes we give him, and that's the secret. Holmes is not static. He's an algorithm before algorithms existed, a pattern of thinking so adaptable it can fit any world. You sit in a smoky London theater in 1939, watching Basil Rathbone stride across the screen in a deerstalker. Outside, the real world edges toward war. But inside the cinema, the detective still outwits the enemy with a raised eyebrow and a matchbox of clues. It's wartime Holmes now, serving king and country, deducing spies instead of murderers. The audience cheers when he exposes a Nazi agent with a single glance. They laugh when Watson bumbles, then cheer again when Holmes saves him. He has become not just clever, but good, a symbol of moral clarity in an age of shadow. And that, perhaps, is his greatest transformation. In his earliest days, Holmes was cold, detached, almost cruel in his precision. But over time, the world refuses to let him stay that way. The public demands warmth, humanity. They demand a Holmes who not only sees truth, but cares what it means. So he changes again. He begins to smile more often, to comfort his clients rather than merely diagnose them. He becomes, paradoxically, more alive in fiction than he ever was in life. The decades blur. London survives the Blitz. Empires fall. Televisions replace radios. And still Holmes remains, each era carving its own version of him. Jeremy Brett brings him back to television in the 1980s. A Holmes both brilliant and broken, elegant and fragile. His performance captures something Doyle hinted at but never named: that the same mind capable of such clarity might also fracture under its own brilliance. Audiences love him for it. They see, perhaps for the first time, that Holmes's genius was not armor but burden. Then, years later, he returns again. Modernized now, texting, scrolling, sprinting through a neon London. This time, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, his intellect is faster than ever, but so too is his loneliness. He's still the same man, pacing, deducing, pretending not to care. But now, the camera lingers on his quiet moments. The tremor in his hand after the adrenaline fades, the softness in his voice when he calls Watson friend. And for all the technology, all the reinvention, the truth remains the same. The story of Sherlock Holmes is not about crime. It's about connection. You realize this as you watch the modern Holmes scrolling through text messages instead of telegrams. The tools have changed, but the essence hasn't. The world is still full of mysteries. People still lie, still love, still vanish. And someone still needs to notice the mud on the shoe, the scent on the letter, the tremor in the voice. That's why Holmes endures. Not because he is infallible, but because he reminds us that attention is its own form of kindness. To observe the world deeply is, in its way, to care about it. Every detective since, Poirot, Miss Marple, Batman, House, even the AI that hums through modern labs, owes a debt to him. They are all variations of that same voice, whispering, "Look closer." The pattern is there. By the end of the century, Holmes has become not just a man or a myth, but a metaphor. Psychologists study his methods. Computer scientists name algorithms after him. Game designers build virtual versions of his cases. AI researchers call their pattern recognition systems Holmesian. He has become what he always sought: a pure mind, detached from time, yet eternally relevant. And yet, you can't help but wonder, if he could see it all now, what would he say? Perhaps he'd stand before a glowing computer screen, studying a line of code and murmur, "Ah, a deduction engine. Primitive, but promising." Perhaps he'd smile faintly and say, "You've mechanized my mind, but not my heart." The algorithm sees patterns, but it doesn't care who's caught in them, because Holmes understood something even his imitators forget. Reason alone cannot save the world. It can only illuminate it. Now, in the quiet hum of the 21st century, you can almost feel him again. Not in the books or screens, but in the small acts of attention. The detective who reopens a cold case after years, the scientist who notices an anomaly in the data, the child who asks one question too many. They are all descendants of that same spark. That moment in Baker Street when a man looked at footprints in the mud and saw an entire life story. That habit of looking closer, thinking deeper, never accepting the obvious. That is Sherlock Holmes. Not a person, but a practice. And maybe, on some future night, when the stars over London blur into the glow of electric haze, someone else will sit by a window, pen in hand, writing about him again. They'll describe the smell of tobacco and the rustle of the Times, the soft click of a magnifying glass opening. They'll start with the same familiar words Watson used so long ago. "In the year 1887, I took my humble rooms at 221B Baker Street, where I first met a man whose methods would change the way I saw the world." And once again, the story will begin. Because the story never ends. The city changes, the centuries pass, but somewhere, a violin still hums through the fog, a fire still crackles in the grate, and a quiet, amused voice still says, "Watson, if you would be so good as to fetch your revolver, the game is afoot." And you, listener, reader, dreamer, feel it too. That old thrill, that warm pulse of curiosity. The reminder that life itself is the greatest mystery, and that even now, somewhere between fact and fiction, Sherlock Holmes is still awake, smiling in the dark, waiting for the next clue to reveal itself. London again. But this time you walk through glass towers instead of brick. The Thames reflects electric light now, not gas lamps, and the sound of carriage wheels has long since been replaced by the low, endless growl of traffic. Yet, somehow, the city still feels like his. Holmes's. The rhythm is different, yes, but the pulse is the same. Restless, alive, full of secrets. If you pause on Baker Street tonight, you'll notice something strange. There's a bronze statue outside the underground station. A tall figure in a deerstalker, coat billowing, pipe in hand. Tourists take photos beside him, smiling, unaware that the man who never existed feels more real than the world that replaced him. You stand beside that statue and look around. Cameras on lampposts blink red in the fog. The modern world has turned into the detective's dream, an entire city wired for observation. Every phone a clue, every algorithm a deduction. If Sherlock Holmes lived today, he'd have traded his magnifying glass for a data feed. He'd have mapped humanity not with footsteps, but with search histories. And you know what? He'd still find the pattern. He always does. You step inside a cafe to escape the chill. The sign outside reads, 221B Espresso. The barista wears a deerstalker, ironically, though his latte art is better than his accent. The air smells of roasted beans instead of pipe tobacco. But you can almost imagine Holmes sitting in the corner, laptop open, violin case leaning against the wall, analyzing security footage while sipping an espresso he swears he doesn't like. The modern world has adopted him completely. Holmes memes float through social media feeds. His quotes show up on motivational posters and programming subreddits alike. Entire forums exist where anonymous users call themselves consulting detectives. comparing notes on how to analyze handwriting, identify falsehoods, or reconstruct a stranger's life from a single photo. Holmes would have been amused, perhaps a little horrified, but mostly amused, because he always knew what the rest of the world only recently discovered. That information itself is the new crime scene. If you think about it, it's easy to see why he fits so neatly into the 21st century. He was, after all, the original data analyst. He gathered evidence, cataloged it, tested hypotheses, and formed conclusions based on patterns others missed. He'd have loved the precision of machine learning, though he'd probably mock the term. Imagine him in this world, sitting at a desk in an open-plan office, screens flickering around him. He'd ignore the emails, the chatter, the noise. Then he'd glance once at a string of encrypted code and say, "Your hacker is left-handed, based in Prague, and drives a Tesla he can't afford." And he'd be right. He wouldn't need fingerprints or footprints now. The world itself leaves trails more obvious than any muddy path: GPS logs, browser histories, timestamps, receipts. Humanity is one vast, open case file. Holmes would thrive here. Yet, you suspect he'd hate it too, because beneath all the data, something essential is missing. The human pulse, the trembling hands, the nervous laughter, the sudden flicker of guilt in a client's eyes. Holmes's brilliance wasn't just logic. It was intuition sharpened to the point of empathy. He didn't just read people. He felt them, even when he pretended not to. And that's what the machines, for all their learning, still can't do. A generation of digital detectives now studies his methods. Online courses titled "Think Like Sherlock" fill the web. They teach observation, logical deduction, even Holmesian mindfulness. Students are told to notice the world in slow motion. The pattern of dirt on shoes, the length of someone's stride, the direction a person looks before they lie. One of the exercises asks students to leave their phones at home for a day and navigate their cities the way Holmes did. Eyes open, ears sharp, brain cataloging everything. Most fail within an hour, because seeing the world the way he did takes energy. It's exhausting to care that much about detail. But those who succeed describe something remarkable: a sense of clarity, a quiet that comes from paying attention. They say it feels almost spiritual. If Holmes were alive now, perhaps he'd run one of these classes himself. He'd stand before a room of students, tapping his cane once against the floor, and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, observation is not a talent, it is a decision. Most people see what they expect. A detective must see what is." He'd pace slowly, scanning faces. "Your world has more information than mine ever did, and yet you understand less. You scroll through infinite clues, but you rarely deduce. You confuse knowing with thinking. You confuse seeing with noticing. You drown in evidence and call it enlightenment." He'd pause, smiling slightly. "My job was easier. The world was smaller and lies were simpler. But I envy you all the same. You live in the grandest puzzle of them all. The world as it could be, if only you'd observe it properly." And you can imagine him, walking among them afterward, correcting posture, adjusting a student's gaze, quietly handing out riddles like assignments. He wouldn't just teach detection, he'd teach discipline of perception. It's strange, isn't it? Holmes lived in an age when information was scarce, and now he belongs to one where it's too abundant. And yet, his voice still cuts through the noise, reminding us that truth, no matter the century, still requires curiosity. You think about that as you scroll through an endless feed of headlines. Wars, scandals, disappearances. Every story a fragment, every fragment a clue. Somewhere, Holmes's ghost must be restless, seeing the connections the rest of us miss. He'd probably be banned from Twitter in a week for unsolicited deduction, but in the end, he wouldn't care. He never worked for applause. He worked for the quiet satisfaction of solving the unsolvable. And that's the paradox of him. He wanted to understand everything, but he never wanted to own it. The modern adaptations keep coming. There's a Holmes and Watson podcast, retelling old cases through binaural sound. There's an animated series where he solves crimes in space. There's even a virtual reality simulation that lets players stand inside 221B, pick up the violin, open the drawer, read Watson's notes. Somewhere out there, millions of players crouch beside digital footprints, whispering the same words he once said aloud. The game is afoot, and maybe that's the most beautiful thing about him. He belongs to everyone now. Every person who tries to make sense of something impossible carries a spark of his spirit. Every scientist, every detective, every curious soul leaning too close to a mystery. They're all versions of him. Holmes isn't dead. He's distributed. But what would he make of us? The people who turned him into legend, who built entire industries around his name. You can picture him walking through a modern London bookshop, shelves lined with his own face. He'd glance once at a wall of merchandise. Mugs, t-shirts, puzzles, even Holmes blend coffee. He'd roll his eyes, of course. The commodification of intellect, he'd mutter. How utterly predictable. Then he'd pause, pick up a book, a new mystery written by someone inspired by him, and skim the first page. He'd smile, just faintly. Still learning, he'd whisper. Good. Then he'd leave the shop, coat billowing behind him, vanishing into the noise of a city that still bears his fingerprints. And you? You step out after him, the evening air cool against your face. The city hums around you. Traffic, footsteps, the low thrum of a train beneath the pavement. Somewhere, far off, a violin plays. You follow the sound through the streets until it leads you to a small square lit by amber lamps. There, beneath a tree, a young musician plays Holmes's melody, the one he used to hum while thinking. It's soft, slow, almost mournful. You close your eyes, listening. For a moment, the centuries fall away. You can almost hear him again. That calm voice, that dry humor, that tireless mind. The man who never existed, teaching the world how to see. And maybe, just maybe, you realize what his greatest case really was. Not the murders or the mysteries, not Moriarty or Adler. It was us. He wanted to see if we could learn to think for ourselves. And looking at the world now, messy, chaotic, curious, you know he succeeded. Because we're still trying. It's late now. You start walking back toward the Thames. The fog drifts low, soft and silver. Streetlights blur into halos. For a moment, you feel like you're walking inside one of Watson's old stories. Between the known and the mysterious. You half expect to hear a voice at your shoulder. Quickly now, there's no time to waste. You turn, but there's no one there. Only the whisper of the city, alive and full of secrets. And in that whisper, you hear it again. The game never ends. You find yourself, at last, drifting into the quiet between centuries. That strange twilight realm where Sherlock Holmes has become both memory and mirror. It is the 21st century now. Yet his presence hasn't faded. It has only changed shape. He's everywhere, if you know how to look. In the clicking of a mechanical keyboard, in the rhythm of an investigator pacing through the night, in the hum of a computer searching through infinite data for a single anomaly. Somewhere out there, another version of Holmes exists. Maybe he's wearing headphones instead of a deerstalker. Maybe he speaks in code rather than in cases. But he's still the same restless intellect, chasing the patterns others overlook. You can feel it, this thread that runs through time. It's not nostalgia. It's continuity. The same curiosity that once burned beneath gas lamps now glows beneath LED light. And the same loneliness that once haunted Baker Street now echoes through digital silence. Because genius, no matter the century, is still lonely, and that's why we still need him. When you think about it, Holmes has become the ultimate paradox, a character more real than most people who ever lived. He's been dead for over 100 years, and yet new evidence about him appears every decade. There are lost cases discovered in archives, secret diaries published by fictional biographers, forgotten correspondence unearthed from basements and attics. None of it is true, but all of it feels possible. It's as though he left behind breadcrumbs for eternity, clues scattered through time, daring us to follow. There's even a rumor, whispered among collectors, that an unpublished Watson manuscript still lies sealed in a box at the British Library. Its label reads, "No for release when the world is ready for the truth." Of course, the curators insist it's fiction, but still, you wonder. Because with Holmes, truth and fiction have always been accomplices, never enemies. Academics debate him as if he were an actual historical figure. There are conferences on his life, symposia on his psychology, papers analyzing his unrecorded cases. Some argue he suffered from bipolar disorder. Others insist he was on the autism spectrum. A few romantics propose that his mind wasn't an illness at all, just an instrument tuned too finely for the noise of the world. One scholar once said, Holmes was the first transhumanist, a man trying to perfect the human brain before technology could. It's a strange thought, but it fits. Holmes, with his chemical experiments and relentless detachment, was always trying to evolve past emotion, past limitation. But life kept pulling him back. Watson's friendship, Irene's cleverness, Mrs. Hudson's tea. These things tethered him to humanity like invisible string. He pretended to disdain them, but they were his anchor. Without them, he'd have floated away into pure abstraction. A mind without a world. In this century, people have begun to build machines that think like Holmes. Artificial intelligence, they call it. Systems that analyze data, detect anomalies, draw conclusions faster than any human ever could. When they work perfectly, they seem miraculous. When they fail, they remind us why Holmes's true genius was never just analysis, but empathy disguised as logic. A machine might solve a case. Holmes understood one. He could stand in a room, feel the air, sense the tension, and know what had been said an hour before. He could look into someone's eyes and see guilt, fear, love, emotions no algorithm can quantify. You think about this when you see modern detectives hunched over screens, scrolling through evidence instead of walking through it. They're efficient, yes. But you wonder, do they ever pause to listen to the silence between facts? Holmes would have. Because deduction to him wasn't mechanical. It was almost spiritual, a ritual of attention. And maybe that's why his methods still feel comforting in a chaotic world. In an era of misinformation, conspiracy, and noise, Holmes represents something we crave but rarely find. Clarity without cruelty. He shows us that logic doesn't have to be cold, that observation doesn't require arrogance, that truth, if sought honestly, can be a kind of compassion. He was never kind in the sentimental sense, but he saw people, even when they wished not to be seen. Especially then. Remember how he once told Watson, "You see, but you do not observe." That wasn't scolding, it was an invitation, a plea, really, to open our eyes, to notice more, to live more consciously. And isn't that, in the end, what we all long for? To be truly seen, even in our contradictions? That's the real reason Holmes endures. Because every person he observed, every thief, every lover, every liar, was a mirror of ourselves. In recent years, something fascinating has happened. Psychologists, philosophers, and writers have started treating Holmes not just as a detective, but as a teacher of awareness. His stories are being studied in mindfulness courses, in leadership seminars, in cognitive therapy sessions. They call it the Holmes effect. The idea is simple. Attention changes everything. To observe something, truly observe it, is to honor it. A patient says they feel unseen, unheard, invisible. The therapist quotes Holmes, "There is nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact." And suddenly, the conversation deepens. A CEO tries to understand his employees' frustrations. A soldier trains to notice small details under stress. A writer studies how to turn observation into empathy. Holmes's lessons live in all of them. He was, after all, the first modern philosopher of perception. Yet there's still one mystery left unsolved. One case even Holmes never cracked. Not a murder, not a theft. A question: why do we love him so much? He isn't warm. He isn't gentle. He isn't even particularly moral by traditional standards. He manipulates. He deceives. He lies when it suits him. He can be arrogant, vain, infuriatingly smug. And yet, we forgive him. Always. Maybe because, beneath all that intellect, there's something profoundly vulnerable about him. The man who understands everyone, but cannot understand himself. The genius who solves the world's chaos, but never his own loneliness. He's every restless mind that's ever stared into the dark, searching for meaning. We don't love him because he's perfect. We love him because he's trying, endlessly, brilliantly, painfully trying, to make sense of a senseless world. Sometimes you imagine him standing in today's London again, just for a moment. He'd hate the noise, the advertisements, the endless distractions, but he'd also be captivated by the energy, the endless data, the new forms of deceit. He'd stand in Piccadilly Circus, scanning faces. He'd note who glances twice at the same billboard, who checks their watch, who fidgets before lying to a companion. Within minutes, he'd reconstruct entire lives from gestures alone. Then, when you approach him, curious, reverent, starstruck, he'd look at you with mild irritation and say, "You're holding your breath. Don't." Because to him, awe was useless. Understanding was the only real form of respect, and after a pause, he might even smile. So then, shall we begin? You wouldn't dare ask what. You'd simply follow. Because when Sherlock Holmes walks, the world suddenly seems decipherable. In the end, that's his greatest gift. Not just the thrill of a solved mystery, but the reminder that clarity is possible. That with enough patience, enough precision, even the most tangled knot of chaos can be unwound. That the human mind, imperfect though it is, can still find order in the noise. And perhaps, though he would never admit it, even a bit of grace. You can almost hear him saying it now, somewhere between memory and dream. There's always a pattern, my dear friend. The trick is to care enough to look for it. Outside, the city hums. Somewhere, a siren wails. Someone hurries home. 1,000 stories unfold, each hiding clues in plain sight. And though the man himself is gone, his method, his way of seeing, lingers like perfume in the fog. You walk on, thinking of him, of how he bridged the gap between reason and wonder, between intellect and heart. You realize that maybe Holmes was never trying to escape humanity at all. Maybe he was just trying to understand it from a place high enough to see the whole picture. And maybe, just maybe, that's where he still is, watching, listening, solving the impossible case of us. There is a kind of silence that comes only at the end of long stories. Not the silence of absence, but the soft hum of completion. You feel that silence now as the last pages of Sherlock Holmes's legend unfurl. But endings are deceptive things. Holmes, as ever, would remind you that nothing truly ends. Everything transforms. He once said, "Life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent." And he was right, because his own life, half myth, half man, became proof of it. As you stand again in the city that birthed him, London stretches out like a living organism. Arteries of road, veins of light, the steady heartbeat of people moving through it. Holmes may be gone, but his method lives in all of them. In every commuter who notices a dropped ticket, every child who asks why, every scientist who refuses to settle for coincidence. You can almost imagine him, walking unseen beside you, watching the city he once ruled through logic. Only this time, he's not studying crime. He's studying us. You pass the statue again on Baker Street. That familiar profile cast in bronze, pipe poised mid-thought. A street performer nearby plays the violin, the notes winding through the evening air like the ghost of an idea. And for a moment, it feels as if the world itself is paying tribute, not to a detective, but to a way of thinking, a way of seeing. The crowd gathers, tourists snapping photos, children laughing, a man in a bowler hat dropping coins into a violin case. None of them know the full story, not really. But they feel it. That's the curious thing about myths. They're contagious, even when misunderstood, because what Holmes represents is something timeless. The stubborn refusal to accept ignorance, the belief that truth, no matter how well hidden, can always be found. He taught us that every mystery, large or small, begins with curiosity, that even when logic fails, observation endures. And that's why he's still here, a century after his death. In the museum just down the street, you climb the narrow staircase to the recreation of 221B. The rooms are warm, cluttered, alive with detail. The worn Persian rug, the tobacco-stained ceiling, the chemical flasks still arranged like an unsolved equation. You run your fingers along the spine of the Times, yellowed with age, half expecting to find fresh notes scribbled in the margins. The beginnings of another deduction. On the mantel, beside the famous pipe, sits a single framed letter. You lean closer. The handwriting is unmistakable. Dr. John H. Watson. It reads simply, "He is gone, and yet he is not." For the keen observer, the world itself has become his casebook. Look closely, and you will find him in every truth that resists darkness. You stand there for a long while, listening to the faint creak of floorboards, the murmur of the city below. And in that stillness, you understand what Watson meant. Holmes was never confined to a flat or even to fiction. He was an attitude, a discipline, a promise that no mystery, not even death, can silence reason forever. Outside, the world continues to reinvent him. There's a new adaptation playing on the West End, The Hound reimagined, blending virtual reality with live performance. Audiences wear headsets, watching digital fog swirl around the stage as holographic hounds prowl in the darkness. In Tokyo, programmers teach AI to think like Holmes, training neural networks on his cases. In New York, psychologists use his stories to train detectives in reading micro-expressions. In Nairobi, school children hold Deduction Day, competing to solve puzzles inspired by him. Even the Mars rover, someone joked, has Holmesian programming. It looks for anomalies in the dust. And across all these versions, one truth remains. He never ages. Holmes is always the same, 39, lean, sharp-eyed, his coat flaring in the wind. Time cannot weather him. It's as if the world agreed collectively that he belongs to every era, but to none. You think of him in his final years, tending bees in Sussex, and realize that even that ending, quiet, simple, human, has become part of his myth. Some imagine he still walks those fields, cane in hand, whispering theories to the hives. Others say he faked his death a second time, vanishing into anonymity, leaving his bees and taking to the road again under a new name. There's no proof either way, of course. But Holmes would have loved that. A final, unsolved case, himself. It suits him, really. The detective who lived by reason becomes, in death, an enigma. You close your eyes and picture him one last time. The room glows amber in firelight. Watson sits opposite, notebook in hand. Outside, a foghorn moans across the Thames. Holmes leans back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The violin rests nearby, half played. "I suppose," he says, "you'll want to write this one down as well." Watson smiles. "Of course, people will want to know." Holmes raises an eyebrow. "Do you really think they care so much about me?" "Not you," Watson says gently. "What you stand for." Holmes studies him for a long moment and then nods. "Very well. But leave out the sentiment. Accuracy before poetry, Watson." Watson laughs. "You've always been a terrible liar." Holmes almost smiles. "And you, my dear friend, have always been a better storyteller than you know." The fire pops. The shadows stretch. For a heartbeat, the world is perfectly still. A moment caught between fiction and forever. In the years that follow, Watson's last stories make their way into print. Readers weep, cheer, debate. Some refuse to believe the ending. Some insist Holmes still lives, that he'll return again when the world needs him. And maybe, in a way, he does. Whenever someone questions what others accept. Whenever a child wonders how the moon can hang so still. Whenever an injustice is undone because one person looked closer. Each of those moments is a little resurrection. Because Holmes was never really about solving crimes. He was about solving ignorance. About daring to see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is. With all its contradictions and secrets. That's what keeps his story alive. Not nostalgia, but necessity. The world still needs its detectives. Not to chase villains, but to protect truth itself. And Holmes, wherever he may be, in imagination, in history, in code, is still guiding them. It's getting late now. The city has quieted. A soft drizzle begins to fall, glistening on the cobblestones. You walk once more past the Thames, where gaslights have become street lamps, and mist still curls like memory. You think of all the versions of him. The Bohemian chemist, the relentless investigator, the lonely genius, the aging beekeeper. You think of Watson too, faithful chronicler whose heart balanced the mind that could not rest. And you realize the two of them were never opposites. They were halves of the same truth, reason and empathy, logic and love, the intellect and the soul. Together, they made sense of the world. One through deduction, the other through devotion. And that's why their story endures. The rain lightens, the city glows. Somewhere, a violin begins to play again. Faint, distant, the same haunting tune Holmes once used to soothe his restless mind. You stop walking and close your eyes. The notes are soft, slower now, almost like a lullaby. They fade into the sound of rain, until you can't tell where music ends and memory begins. And as you listen, you realize that this too is part of the pattern. Every ending Holmes ever had was simply a doorway back into another mystery. He would have wanted it that way, because the greatest detective in history never wanted to finish the story. He only wanted to keep following it. And so he does. Through time, through imagination, through every curious mind that refuses to stop asking why. The fire fades. The violin slows. The casebook closes. For now, wind down, 300 words. And so, as the night settles around you, let the sound of London soften into a hush. The carriages are long gone, but the rhythm remains. Rain on cobblestone, footsteps in memory, the faint hum of thought in motion. Imagine the fog outside your window thickening just enough to blur the world's edges, the way it once did outside Baker Street. You can almost see the flicker of gaslight through it. The silhouette of a man in a long coat, pausing to light his pipe. He glances back once. Not at you exactly, but through you. As though you're part of the mystery, part of the world he's been studying all along. Then he turns and vanishes into the mist. You exhale slowly. The sound of the violin fades. The city exhales with you. The questions you carried into this story drift away, not answered, but understood, because that's the quiet genius of Holmes. He doesn't solve everything. He simply teaches you how to notice what matters. So let your thoughts slow now, like the turning of pages at the end of a beloved book. Let the rain be your metronome, steady and soft. Let the mystery of the world become gentle enough to rest in. Somewhere, between reason and dream, a voice whispers, calm and certain. The game is never over, my friend, only paused. And you smile, sinking deeper into the quiet. Because somewhere out there, beyond the fog, the violin still plays.